Hey, everybody. All right, so today on the docket, we're going to be getting into the rest of House in the Borderlands and be finding out whatever little story is in that little pocketbook they found. But first, because we're probably going to be spending the rest of the session just reading that. Hey, it's Tony. I'm thinking we'll start off with a short story. For this one, I picked a mystery by the name of, let's see, what's our title here? The Gerrard Street Mystery by, what was the gentleman's name? It's John Charles Dent, an author I've never heard of before, but I skimmed it and it seemed interesting, so we'll go with that. So I don't see any reason. There's a little forward about the author himself. It's not terribly interesting, so I think we'll skip that. But I don't see any reason to wait any longer. Let's get started on the Gerrard Street Mystery. So, Chapter 1. My name is William Francis Furlong. It's a good-ass name. My occupation is that of a commission merchant, and my place of business is on St. Paul Street in the city of Montreal. I have resided in Montreal ever since shortly after my marriage in 1862 to my cousin, to my cousin, Alice Blader of Toronto. My name may not be familiar to the present generation of Torontoni. Yeah, I mean, it's the 1800s. To the present generation of Torontonians, though I was born in Toronto and passed the early years of my life there. Since the days of my youth, my visits to the upper province have been few and, with one exception, very brief. So that I might have doubtlessly passed out of remembrance out of many persons with whom I was once on terms of intimacy. Still, there are several residents of Toronto with whom I am happy to... Oh, let me double check one thing. Oh, hey, Crucy. Did I... Okay, recording is done. All right. Sorry for that little interruption. Where did we leave off? Still, there are several residents of Toronto whom I am happy to number among my warmest personal friends at the present day. There are also a good many persons of middle age, not in Toronto only, but scattered here and there throughout the various parts of Ontario, who will have no difficulty in recalling my name as one of their fellow students at the Upper Canada College. The name of my late uncle, Richard Yardington, also, I can't place why that name is so funny to me. Yardington is, of course, well known to all old residents of Toronto, where he spent the last 32 years of his life. He settled there in the year 1829. I'm sure this is all very important to the story. When the place was still known as Little York, he opened a small store on Yonge Street. Oh, hey, Yonge Street. I know that. And his commercial career was reasonably prosperous one. By steady degrees, the small store developed into what, in those times, was regarded as a considerable establishment. In the course of years, the owner acquired a competency, and in 1854 retired from business altogether. From that time up to the day of his death, he lived in his own house on Gerrard Street. So he's old money. That whole paragraph is just he's old money, and he married his cousin. That's our protagonist. After mature deliberation, I have resolved to give the Canadian public an account of some rather singular circumstances connected with my residence in Toronto. Though repeatedly urged to do so, I have hitherto refrained from giving any extended publicity to those circumstances, in consequence of my own inability to see any good to be served thereby. The only person, however, whose reputation can be injuriously affected by the details has been dead for some years. Ain't that the truth? He has left behind him no one whose feelings can be shocked by the disclosure, and the story is in itself sufficiently remarkable to be worth the telling. Told accordingly, it shall be, and the only fictitious element introduced into the narrative shall be the name of one of the persons most immediately concerned in it. At the time of taking up his abode in Toronto, or rather in Little York, my Uncle Richard was a widower and childless, his wife having died several months previously. His only relatives on this side of the Atlantic were two maiden sisters, a few years younger than himself. He never contacted a second matrimonial alliance. That's a word for marriage. And for some time after his arrival here, his sisters lived in his house and were dependent upon him for support. After the lapse of a few years, both of them married and settled down in homes of their own. The elder of them subsequently became my mother. She was left a widow when I was a mere boy and survived my father only a few months. I was an only child, and as my parents had been in humble circumstances, the charge of my maintenance devolved onto my uncle, to whose kindness I am indebted for such educational training as I have received. After sending me to school and college for several years, he took me into his store and gave me my first insight into commercial life. I lived with him, and both then and always received at his hands the kindness of a father, in which light I eventually almost came to regard him. His younger sister, who was married to a watchmaker named Elias Plater, lived in Quebec from the time of her marriage until her death, which took place in 1846. Again, I hope you're keeping track of all these dates. I'm sure they're going to be very important. Her husband has been unsuccessful in business and was moreover of dissipated habits. He was left with one child, a daughter, on his hands, and as my uncle was averse to the idea of his sister's child remaining under the control of one so unfit to provide for her welfare, he proposed to adopt the little girl as his own. To this proposition, Mr. Elias Plater readily assented, and little Alice was soon domiciled under her uncle and myself in Toronto. Oh yeah, this is the cousin that he married. Well, at least she wasn't like 20 years younger than him or something. Brought up as we were under the same roof and seeing each other every day of our lives, a childish attachment sprang up between my cousin Alice and myself. As the years rolled by, this attachment ripened into a tender affection, which eventually resulted in an engagement between us. Oh yeah, actually, you make a good point. Yes, she was more like a sister. What is the mystery? Is the mystery of your weird family history? Because that's the only mystery I'm seeing so far. Our engagement was made with the full and cordial approval of my uncle, who did not share the prejudice attained by so many persons against marriage between cousins. Oh, what an open-minded individual. He stipulated, however, that our marriage should be deferred until I had seen somewhat more of the world, until we had both reached an age which we might reasonably be presumed to know our own minds. He was also, not unnaturally, desirous that before taking upon myself the responsibility of marriage, I should give some evidence of my ability to provide for a wife, and for other contingencies usually consequent upon matrimony. Oh, goodness. He made no secret of his intention to divide... I missed this during the skimming, so this is a nice new surprise for me. He made no secret of his intention to divide his property between Alice and myself at his death, and the fact that no actual division would be necessary at the event of our marriage with each other was doubtless one reason for his ready acquiescence for our engagement. It makes the money more simple, of course. He was, however, of a vigorous constitution, strictly regular and methodical in all of his habits, and likely to live to an advanced age. He could hardly be called parsimonious, but, like most men who have successfully fought their own way through life, he was rather fond of authority, and little disposed to divest himself of his wealth until he should have no further occasion for it. He expressed his willingness to establish me in business, either in Toronto or elsewhere, and give me the benefit of his expertise in all mercantile transactions. It's a very important detail, Crucy. I hope you understand. It's part of the mystery. Sorry about that. I had to adjust my mic. I need to adjust it again. There we go. Much better. When matters had reached this pass, I had just completed my 21st year, my cousin being 3 years younger. Since my uncle's retirement, I had engaged in one or two little speculations on my own account, which had turned out fairly successful, but I had not devoted myself to any regular or fixed pursuit. Before any definite arrangements had been concluded as to the course of my future life, a circumstance occurred which seemed to open the way for me to good account such mercantile talent as I possessed. An old friend of my uncle's opportunely arrived in Toronto from Melbourne, Australia. Yeah, I don't. No, this is not the author. The author is their last name is Dent, not whatever the fuck this guy was. I've forgotten already. It was just a funny name. I don't know. There's eventually a mystery, I promise. I don't know if any of this is actually important. Where, in the course of a few years, he had risen from the position of a junior clerk to that of a senior partner in a prominent commercial house. He painted the land of his adoption in glowing colors, and assured my uncle and myself that it presented an inviting field for a young man of energy and business capacity, more especially if he had a small capital at his command. Yeah, I'm honestly confused too. The matter was carefully debated in our domestic circle. I was naturally averse to separation from Alice, but my imagination took fire at Redpath's glowing account of his own splendid success. I pictured myself returning to Canada after an absence of 4 or 5 years with a mountain of gold at my command as the result of my own energy and acuteness. We're fucking bootstrappers up in this bitch. In imagination, I saw myself settled down with Alice in a palatial mansion on Jarvis Street, and living in affluence all the rest of my days. Fiancé. Not wife yet. Sister cousin fiancé. My uncle bade me consult my own judgment in the matter, but rather encouraged the idea than otherwise. He offered me an advance of L, I assume that's the currency at the time in Canada, which I'm not familiar with. 500 of them. He offered to advance me 500 of them, and I had about half of that as the result of my own speculation. Mr. Redpath, who was just about returning to Melbourne, promised to aid me to the extent of his power with his local knowledge and advice, and less than a fortnight from that time, he and I were on our way to the other side of the globe. Lucre? Maybe. Oh, I bet it is pounds. That would be... I forget that that's like a thing. I don't think I've ever seen the L used for money pounds, though. But I bet you're right. Oh, goodness. We reached our destination early in the month of September, 1857. My life in Australia... I hope you guys... Someone's making a chart of this, right? We're keeping track of the dates? I hope so. There will be a quiz. My life in Australia has no direct bearing upon the course of events to be related. Has any of this had any direct bearing? I hope so, and maybe passed over in very few words. Well, thank you. I engaged in various enterprises and achieved a certain measure of success. If none of my ventures proved eminently prosperous, I at least met with no serious disasters. At the end of 4 years, that is to say, in September 1861, yes, that maths out, I made up my account with the world and found I was worth $10,000. I guess it was dollars. There's just L, maybe. I don't know. Oh, well, I guess Australian dollars. That would be a thing. I had, however, become terribly homesick and longed for the termination of my voluntary exile. I had, of course, kept up a regular correspondence with Alice and Uncle Richard, and of late they had both pressed me to return home. You have enough, for my uncle, to give you a start in Toronto, and I see no reason why Alice and you shouldn't be kept apart any longer. You should be kept, excuse me. You will have no housekeeping expenses, for I intend you to live with me. I am getting old and shall be glad of your companionship in my declining years. You will have a comfortable home while I live, and when I die, you will get all that I have between you. Write as soon as you receive this, and let us know how soon you can be here. The sooner, the better. The letter containing this pressing information found me in a mood very much disposed to accept it. The only He's doing his best, I guess. The only enterprise I had on hand, which would be likely to delay me, was a transaction in wool, which, as I believed, would be closed by the end of January or the beginning of February. By the 1st of March, I should certainly be in a condition to start on my homeward voyage, and I determined that my departure should take place at about that time. I wrote both to Alice and my uncle, apprising them of my intention, and announcing my expectation to reach Toronto not later than the middle of May. The letters so written were posted on the 19th of September, in time for the mail, which left on the following day. On the 27th, to my huge surprise and gratification, the wool transaction referred to was unexpectedly concluded, and I was at liberty, if so disposed, to start for home by the next fast mail steamer, the Southern Cross. Again, it's very important that we know what was the name of the boat. Leaving Melbourne on the 11th of October. I was so disposed, and made my preparations accordingly. It was useless, I reflected, to write to my uncle or to Alice, acquainting them with my change of plans, for I should take the shortest route home, and probably be in Toronto as soon as the letter could get there. I resolved to telegraph from New York upon my arrival there, so as not to take them altogether by surprise. The morning of the 11th of October found me on board the Southern Cross, where I shook hands with Mr. Redpath and several other friends who had accompanied me on board for a last farewell. The particulars of the voyage to England are not pertinent to the story and may be given very briefly. Why are they given at all? I took the Red Sea route. I took the Red Sea route and arrived at Marseille around 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the 29th of November. From Marseille, I traveled by rail to Calais, and so impatient was I to reach the journey's end without loss of time that I did not even stay over to behold the glories of Paris. I had a commission to execute in London, which, however, delayed me there only a few hours, and I hurried down to Liverpool in the hopes of catching a Cunard steamer to New York. The Cunard steamer, excuse me. I missed it by about 2 hours, but the Persia was detailed to start... thank God! But the Persia was detailed to start on a special trip to Boston on the following day. I secured a berth, and at 8 o'clock the next morning, steamed out of Mersey on my way homeward. I'm just sitting here. I have no words. The voyage from Liverpool to Boston consumed 14 days. All I need say about it is this whole paragraph, that before arriving in the latter port, I formed an intimate acquaintance with one of the passengers, Mr. Junius H. Gridley, a Boston merchant who was returning from a hurried business trip to Europe. He was, and is, a most agreeable companion. I guess he had all of this lore, this history, this very storied character, Mr. I've forgotten his name already. William Francis Furlong. Old Bill Furlong. He's had a lot of history. He's a very, very lived-in character. He was and is a most agreeable companion. We were thrown together a good deal during the voyage, and we laid the foundation of a friendship which has ever since subsisted between us. They didn't know how to write yet. God, it feels like it. Well, now keep in mind, God, it might have actually been worth reading the background. This guy's background is, in addition to being an author, he was a historian. So maybe this is just what got him off. This was his shit. All of these details and dates just got him so roasty toasty. He loved it. He loves these dates. He cannot live without them. Before the dome of the State House loomed in sight, he had extracted a promise from me to spend the night with him before pursuing my journey. We landed at the wharf in East Boston on the evening of 17th of December, and I accompanied him to his house in West... keep in mind, this is a traditional mystery. These details might still be important. We don't know what the mystery is. Maybe all of these things are necessary to solving the riddle of the mystery. The riddle story. We landed at the wharf in East Boston on the evening of the 17th of December, and I accompanied him to his house on West Newton Street, where I remained until the following morning. The mystery's the plot. Yeah. Upon consulting the timetable, we found that the Albany Express would leave at 11:30 a.m. This left several hours at my disposal, and we sallied forth immediately after breakfast to visit some of the lions at the American Athens. Oh, he went to the zoo! In the course of our peregrine... Someone look up that word. I don't know what that means. If someone wouldn't mind. Peregrinations? Oh, like swooping like a falcon, maybe? We dropped off the post office, which... Oh, God. Okay, this will all be worth it if this is a zoo mystery. And he needed to have the reason. The character couldn't just be in the in the American Athens. He had to have a reason to be there. He's a Canadian. Why would he be there? Well, let's tell the whole story of how he got there. In the course of our peregrinations through the streets, we dropped into the post office, which had recently been established in the Merchants Exchange building on State Street. Seeing the countless piles of mail matter, especially long or meandering journey. Okay. Maybe that's more just the origin of why the peregrine falcon is called that rather than the other way around. But thank you. Thank you, Chrissy. Seeing the countless piles of mail matter, I jestingly remarked to my friends that there seemed to be letters enough there to go around the whole human family. Just going to dwell on the phrase human family. Remarked by a guy marrying his sister cousin. He replied in the same mood, whereupon I banteringly suggested the probability that among so many letters, surely there ought to be one for me. Nothing more reasonable, he replied. Nothing more reasonable, he replied. We Bostonians are always bountiful to our strangers. Here is the general delivery, and here is the department where letters addressed to the Furlong family are kept in stock. Pray inquire for yourself. Oh, I think we're getting into the mystery. The joke, I confessed, was not a very brilliant one, but with a grave countenance, I stepped up to the wicket and asked the young lady in attendance, "Anything for W.F. Furlong?" She looked from a pigeonhole to a handful of correspondence and proceeded to run her eye over the addresses. When about half the pile had been exhausted, she stopped and propounded the usual inquiry in the case of strangers. "Where you expect letters from?" "From Toronto," I replied. To my no small astonishment, she immediately handed me a letter. Oh, no, we're getting... Okay, there's actually a point for all of this. We're actually going somewhere. To my no small astonishment, she immediately handed me a letter bearing the Toronto postmark. The address was in the peculiar and well-known handwriting of my Uncle Richard. Scarcely crediting the evidence of my senses, I tore open the envelope and read as follows. Toronto, 9th December, 1861. My dear William, I am so glad to know that you are coming home so much sooner than you expected when you wrote last, and that you will eat your Christmas dinner with us. For reasons which you will learn when you arrive, it will not be a Merry Christmas at our house, but your presence will make it much more bearable than it would be without you. I have not told Alice that you are coming. Let it be a joyful surprise for her as some compensation for the sorrow she has had to endure lately. You needn't telegraph. I will meet you at the GWR station. Your affectionate uncle, Richard Yardington. Oh no, the mystery. Y'all, the mystery is how the fuck did his uncle know he was coming early? All of that was important. That's why the dates were all there. I'm dying. I'm dying, Squirtle. I need a minute. I mean, that's kind of pleasant, actually. I'm back on board. You got me back, Dent. I mean, you know, like, so many mysteries are about murder or, you know, like theft or or like what have you. What's a nice mystery of just like, how the fuck did you know I was coming, Uncle? Mostly murder. That's not bad. That's a nice little refreshing change of pace. I appreciate it. Why, what's the matter? My friend asked my friend, seeing the blank look of surprise in my face. Of course the letter is not for you. Why on earth did you open it? It is for me, I answered. See here, Gridley old man. Have you been playing me a trick? If you haven't, this is the strangest thing I ever knew in my life. Oh, this is being told backwards. So unfortunately, Tony, that's not in the cards. I think we even know that she like passed on before him. I'm sorry, that revelation. I don't remember what we've read. I've been sitting to a fucking a ruffle, a blur. Excuse me. Of course, he hadn't been playing me a trick. A moment's reflection showed me that such a thing was impossible. Here was the envelope with the Toronto postmark of the 19th of December, at which time he had been with me on board the Persia, as we know, on the banks of Newfoundland. Wait, they went to... I guess that was just the route, and he promised to stay over so that he wouldn't leave. Anyway, I'm sorry, that's beside the point. Besides, he was a gentleman and would not have played so poor and stupid a joke upon a guest. And to put the matter beyond all possibility of doubt, I remembered that I had never mentioned my cousin's name in his hearing. I handed him the letter. He read it carefully through twice over, and was as much mystified as its contents as myself. For during our passage across the Atlantic, I had explained to him the circumstances under which I was returning home. By what conceivable means had my uncle been made aware of my departure from Melbourne? Had Mr. Redpath written to him as soon as I was acquainted with that gentleman and my intention? As soon as I acquainted that gentleman with my intentions? But even if such were the case, the letter could not have left before I did, and could not possibly have reached Toronto by the 9th of December. Had I been seen in England by someone who knew me, and had not one written from there? Most unlikely. And even if such a thing had happened, I'm sorry, I'm completely discombobulated by this mystery. I'm very thrown. Most unlikely, and even if such a thing had happened, it was impossible that the letter should have reached Toronto by the 9th. I need hardly inform the reader that there was no telegraphic communication at that time. And how could my uncle know that I would take the Boston route? And if he had known, how could he foresee that I would do anything so absurd as to call at the Boston post office and inquire for letters? I will meet you at the GWR station. How was he to know by what train I would reach Toronto unless I notified him by telegraph? And that he expressly stated to be unnecessary. While he was murdering? Yes. She's a psychic. I hope it's not something like that. We did no more sightseeing. I obeyed the hint contained in the letter and sent no telegram. My friend accompanied me down to the Boston and Albany station, where I waited in feverish impatience for the departure of the train. We talked over the matter until 11:30 in the vain hope of finding some clue to the mystery. Then I started on my journey. Mr. Gridley's curiosity was aroused, and I promised to send him an explanation immediately upon my arrival at home. No sooner had the train glided out of the station than I settled myself into my seat, drew the tantalizing letter from my pocket, and proceeded to read and reread it again and again. A very few perusals sufficed to fix its contents in my memory, so that I could repeat every word with my eyes shut. Still, I continued to scrutinize the paper, the penmanship, and even the tint of the ink. For what purpose, you ask? For no purpose, except that I hoped, in some mysterious manner, to obtain more light on the subject. No light came, however. The more I scrutinized and pondered, the greater was my mystification. The paper was a simple sheet of white letter paper, of the kind ordinarily used by my uncle in his correspondence. So as far as I could see, there was nothing peculiar about the ink. Anyone familiar with my uncle's writing could have sworn that no hand but his had penned the lines. His well-known signature, a masterpiece of involved hieroglyphics, was there in all its indistinctness, written as no one but himself could have written it. And yet, for some unaccountable reason, I was half disposed to suspect forgery. Forgery! What nonsense! Anyone clever enough to imitate Richard Yardington's handwriting would have employed his talents more profitably than indulging in a mischievous and purposeless jest. Not a bank in Toronto would have discounted a note with that signature affixed to it. Desisting from all attempts to solve these problems, I then tried to fathom the meaning of the other points in the letter. What misfortune had happened to mar the Christmas festivities at my uncle's house? And what could be the reference to my cousin Alice's sorrows mean? She was not ill. That, I thought, might be taken for granted. My uncle would hardly have referred to her illness as one of the sorrows she had to endure lately. Certainly, illness may be regarded in the light of a sorrow, but sorrow was not precisely the word which a straightforward man like Uncle Richard would have applied to it. I could conceive of no other cause of affliction in her case. My uncle was well, as was evinced by his having written the letter, and by his avowed intention to meet me at the station. Her father had died long before I started for Australia. She had no other near relation except myself, and she had no cause for anxiety, much less for sorrow on my account. I thought it singular, too, that my uncle, having in some strange manner become acquainted with my movements, had withheld the knowledge from Alice. It did not square with my preconceived ideas of him that he would derive any satisfaction from taking his niece by surprise. All was a muddle together as my temples throbbed with the intensity of my thoughts. I was half disposed to believe myself in a troubled dream from which I should presently awake. Meanwhile, on glided the train. Oh, more trip details. I'm sure these are all going to also be very important. A heavy snowstorm delayed us for several hours, and we reached Hamilton too late for the midday express for Toronto. We got there, however, in time for the accommodation leaving at 3:15 p.m., and we would reach Toronto at 5:05. I walked from one end of the train to the other in hopes of finding someone I knew from whom I could make inquiries about home. Not a soul. I saw several persons whom I knew to be residents of Toronto, but none with whom I had ever been personally acquainted, and none of them would be likely to know anything about my uncle's domestic arrangements. All that remained to be done under these circumstances was to restrain my curiosity as well as I could until reaching Toronto. By the by, would my uncle really meet me at the station, according to his promise? Surely not. By what means could he possibly know that I would arrive by this train? Still, he seemed to have such accurate information respecting my proceedings that there was no saying where his knowledge began or ended. I tried not to think about the matter, but as the train approached Toronto, my impatience became positively feverish in its intensity. We were not more than 3 minutes behind time as we glided in front of the Union Station. I passed out onto the platform of the car and peered intently through the darkness. Suddenly, my heart gave a great bound. There, sure enough, standing in the front of the door of the waiting room, was my uncle, plainly discernible by the fitful gaze of the overhanging lamps. Before the train came to a standstill, I sprang from the car and advanced towards him. He was looking out for me, but his eyes not being as young as mine, he did not recognize me until I grasped him by the hand. He greeted me warmly, seizing me by the waist, almost raising me from the ground. At once I noticed several changes in his appearance, changes for which I was wholly unprepared. He had aged very much since I had last seen him, and the lines about his mouth had deepened considerably. The iron gray which I remembered so well had disappeared, its place being supplied with a new and rather dandified-looking wig. The old-fashioned greatcoat which he had worn ever since I could remember had been supplanted by a modern frock of spruce cut with sealskin collar and cuffs. All this I noticed in the first hurried greetings that passed between us. "Never mind your luggage, my boy," he remarked. "Leave it till tomorrow, when we will send down for it. If you are not tired, we'll walk home instead of taking a cab. I have a good deal to say to you before we get there." I had not slept since leaving Boston, but was much too excited to be conscious of fatigue, and as will readily be believed, I was anxious enough to hear what he had to say. We passed from the station and proceeded up York Street, arm in arm. "And now, Uncle Richard," I said, as soon as we were well clear of the crowd, "keep me no longer in suspense. First and foremost, is Alice well?" "Quite well, but for reasons you will soon understand, she is in deep grief. You must know that—" "But," I interrupted, "tell me, in the name of all that is wonderful, how you knew I was coming by this train, and how did you come to write me at Boston?" Just then, we came to the corner of Front... Oh, he's cut off. Just then, we came to the corner of Front Street, where was a lamppost. As we reached the spot where the light of the lamp was most brilliant, he turned half round, looked me full in the face, and smiled a sort of wintry smile. The expression of his countenance was almost ghastly. "Uncle," I quickly said, "what's the matter? Are you not well?" "I am not as strong as I used to be, and I have a good deal to try me of late. Have patience, and I will tell you all. Let us walk more slowly, or I shall not finish before we get home. In order that you may clearly understand how matters are, I'd better begin at the beginning." Oh boy, more background details. "And I hope you will not interrupt me with any questions until I have done. How I knew you would call by Boston Post Office, and how you would arrive in Toronto by this train, will come last in order. Of course. By the by, have you my letter with you?" "The one you wrote to me at Boston? Yes, here it is," I replied, taking it from my pocketbook. "Let me have it." I handed it to him, and he put it in the breast pocket of his inside coat. I wondered at this proceeding on his part, but made no remark upon it. We moderated our pace, and he began his narration. Of course, I don't pretend to remember his exact words, but they were to this effect. During the winter following my departure from Melbourne, he had formed the acquaintance of a gentleman who had recently settled in Toronto. The name of this gentleman was Marcus Weatherly, who had commenced business as a wholesale provision merchant immediately upon his arrival, and had been engaged in it ever since. For more than 3 years, the acquaintance between him and my uncle had been very slight, but during the last summer they had had some real estate transactions together and had become intimate. Weatherly, who was comparatively a young man and unmarried, had been invited to the house on Gerrard Street, where he had more recently become a pretty frequent visitor. More recently still, his visits had become so frequent that my uncle suspected him of a desire to be attentive to my cousin, and had thought proper to enlighten him as to her engagement with me. From that day, his visits had been voluntarily discontinued. My uncle had not given much consideration to the subject until a fortnight afterwards, when he had accidentally become aware of the fact that Weatherly was in embarrassed circumstances. Here my uncle paused in his narrative to take a breath. He then added in a low tone, and putting his mouth almost close to my ear, "And, Willie, my boy, I have at last found out something else. He has $42,000 falling due here and in Montreal within the next 10 days, and he has forged my signature to acceptances for $39,716.24. He forged his signature. The letter's a fake. No, Weatherly's a crook. Those, to the best of my belief, were his exact words. We had walked up York Street to Queen and gone down from Queen, and then gone down to Queen to Yonge. We then turned up the east side on our way to homeward. At the moment when the last words were uttered, we had got a few yards north of Crookshank Street. Immediately, but we're not getting the last words of the story. Or maybe those were the last words. Immediately in front of a chemist shop, which was, I think, the third house from the corner. The window of this shop was well lighted, and its brightness was reflected on the sidewalk in front. Just then, two gentlemen walking rapidly in the opposite direction to that we were taking brushed by us, but I was too deeply absorbed in my uncle's communication to pay much attention to passers-by. Scarcely had they passed, however, ere one of them stopped and exclaimed, "Surely that is Willie Furlong!" I don't know what that voice is. I turned and recognized Johnny Gray, one of my oldest friends. I relinquished my uncle's arm for a moment and shook hands with Gray, who said, "I'm surprised to see you. I heard only a few days ago that you were not to be here till next spring." "I am here," I remarked, somewhat in advance of my own expectations. I then hurriedly inquired after several of our common friends, to which inquiries he briefly replied. "Oh, well," he said, "but you are in a hurry, and so am I. Don't let me detain you. Be sure and look in on me tomorrow. You will find me at the old place, in the Romaine buildings." We again shook hands, and he passed down the street with the gentleman who accompanied him. I then turned to repossess myself of my uncle's arm. The old gentleman had evidently walked on, for he was not in sight. I hurried along, making sure of overtaking him before reaching Gold Street, for my interview with Gray had occupied barely a minute. In another minute, I was at the corner of Gold Street. No signs of Uncle Richard. I quickened my pace to a run, which soon brought me to Gerrard Street. Still no signs of my uncle. I had certainly not passed him on the way, and he could not have gotten farther on his homeward route than here. He must have called in at one of the stores, but strange thing for him to do under the circumstances. I retraced my steps all the way out to the front of the chemist's shop, peering into every window and doorway as I passed along. No one in the least resembling him was to be seen. Yeah, Uncle's dead. He got yanked into an alley and shanked. You get the old yank and shank. I stood still for a moment and reflected. Even if he had run at full speed, a thing most unseemly for him to do, he could not have reached the corner of Gerrard Street before I had done so. And what should he run for? He certainly did not wish to avoid me, for he had more to tell me before reaching home. Perhaps he had turned down Gold Street. At any rate, there was no use waiting for him. I might as well go home at once. And I did. Upon reaching the old familiar spot, I opened the gate, passed up on the steps to the front door, and rang the bell. The door was opened by a domestic who had not we don't get details on the domestic because they're just help, of course, who had not formed part of the establishment at the time, in my time, and who did not know me, but Alice happened to be passing through the hall and heard my voice as I inquired for Uncle Richard. Another moment, and she was in my arms. With a strange foreboding in my heart, I noticed that she was deep in mourning. She was dressed in black. We passed into the dining room where the table was laid for dinner. "Has Uncle Richard come in?" I asked, as soon as we were alone. "Why did he run away from me?" "Who?" exclaimed Alice with a start. "What do you mean, Willie? Is it possible you have not heard?" "Heard what?" "I see you have not heard," she replied. "Sit down, Willie, and prepare yourself for painful news." What a way to say that. But first, tell me what you meant by saying what you did just now. Who was it that ran away from you? "Well, perhaps I should hardly call it running away, but he certainly disappeared most mysteriously, down here in the corner of Young and Crookshank Street." "Of whom are you speaking?" "Of Uncle Richard, of course." "Uncle Richard? The corner of Young and Crookshank Street? When did you see him there?" "When? A quarter of an hour ago. He met me at the station and walked up together till I met Johnny Gray. We turned to speak to Johnny for a moment when—" "Willie, what on earth are you talking about? You're laboring under some strange delusion. Uncle Richard died of apoplexy more than 6 weeks ago and lies buried in St. James Cemetery." Chapter 2. I'm going to take a quick break, run to the bathroom, and just let y'all stew on that for a second. Okay, first of all, I cannot fucking believe that all of that preamble was actually necessary. Like, fully. I don't think any of it was extraneous. I mean, maybe a little bit, but but I'm afraid to say that because it might still be relevant at some point. And secondly, I've kind of flipped around on the story. I'm kind of here for it now. I don't know about y'all. Yeah, I mean, it's not... I mean, Tony, you're right. It's still gross, but it is unfortunately an artifact of the time. Sort of. I guess this was at a point where that was sort of becoming gauche. I'm personally betting it's an impersonator, because I don't expect this story to introduce a proper supernatural element. I think it wants us to suspect a supernatural element, but I'm guessing. I don't know. If it was an impersonator, why would they have any reason to tell him all of that stuff? It is, if you'll forgive me, a mystery. So, let's move on with chapter 2. I don't know how long I sat there, trying to think, with my face buried in my hands. My mind had been kept on strain during the last 30 hours, and the succession of surprises to which I had been subjected had temporarily paralyzed my faculties. Honestly, dude, can't blame you. For a few moments after Alice's announcement, I must have been in a sort of stupor. My imagination, I remember, ran riot about everything in general and nothing in particular. My cousin's momentary impression was that I had met with an accident of some kind, which had unhinged my brain. The first distinct remembrance I have after this is that I suddenly awoke from my stupor to find Alice kneeling at my feet and holding me by the hand. Then my mental powers came back to me, and I recalled all of the incidents of the evening. When did Uncle's death take place? I asked. On the 3rd of November, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It was quite unexpected, though he had not enjoyed his usual health for some weeks before. He fell down in the hall just as he was returning from a walk and died within 2 hours. He never spoke or recognized anyone after his seizure. What has become of his old overcoat? I asked. His old overcoat? Willie, what a question. I replied Alice, evidently thinking that I was again drifting back into insensibility. Did he continue to wear it up to the day of his death? I asked. No, cold weather set in very early this last fall, and he was compelled to don his winter clothing earlier than usual. He had a new overcoat made within a fortnight. Oh, the seal skin! That detail's important, of course. He had a new overcoat made within a fortnight before he died. He had it on at the time of his seizure, but why do you ask? Was the new coat cut by a fashionable tailor, and it had a fur collar and cuffs? It was cut at Stovall's, I think. It had a fur collar and cuffs. And when did he begin to wear a wig? About the same time that he began to wear his new overcoat. I wrote, what if he's not actually dead? What if the person replaced him and he's just been kidnapped? I'm sorry. I can't stop the story of speculation or it'll take forever. I wrote you a letter at the time, making merry over his youthful appearance and hinting, of course, only in jest, that he was out looking for a young wife. But you surely did not receive my letter. You must have been on your way home before it was written. I left Melbourne on the 11th of October. The wig, I suppose, was buried with him? Yes. And where is the overcoat? In the wardrobe upstairs, in Uncle's room. Come and show it to me. It's getting spicy. I led the way upstairs, my cousin following. Stop referring to her as your cousin. I want to forget that she's your sister cousin sister. Please. In the hall of the first floor, and the first cousins too, not even second cousins. In the hall of the first floor, we encountered my old friend Mrs. Daly, the housekeeper. She threw up her hands in surprise at seeing me. Our greeting was very brief. I was too intent on solving the problem which had exercised my mind ever since receiving the letter at Boston to pay much attention to anything else. Fair enough. 2 words, however, explained to her where we were going, and our request she accompanied us. We passed into my uncle's room. My cousin drew the key of the wardrobe from a drawer where it was kept and unlocked the door. There hung the overcoat. A single glance was sufficient. It was the same. The dazed sensation in my head began to make itself felt again. The atmosphere of the room seemed to oppress me, and closing the door of the wardrobe, I led the way downstairs again to the dining room, followed by my cousin, Mrs. Daly had sense enough to perceive that we were discussing family matters and retired to her own room. I took my cousin's hand in mine and asked, "Will you tell me what you know of Mr. Marcus Weatherly?" This was evidently another surprise for her. How could I have heard of Marcus Weatherly? She answered, however, without hesitation. "I know very little of him. Uncle Richard and he had some dealings a few months since, and in that way he became a visitor here. After a while he began to call pretty often, but his visits suddenly ceased a short time before Uncle's death. I need not affect any reserve with you." What? I need not affect any reserve with you. Oh, right. I don't need to... I don't need to, like, beat around the bush. That's what she is saying. That was a confusing phrase to me. Yes. Yes, thank you. Uncle Richard thought he came after me and gave him a hint that you had the proper claim. Proper claim? He never called afterwards. I am rather glad that he didn't, for there is something about him that I don't quite like. I am at a loss to say what that something is, but his manner always impressed me with the idea that he was not exactly what he seemed to be on the surface. Perhaps I misjudged him. Indeed, I think I must have done so, for he stands well with everybody and is highly respected. He's highly suspected by me. I looked at the clock on the mantelpiece. It was 10 minutes to 7. I rose from my seat. "I will ask you to excuse me for an hour or two, Alice. I must find Johnny Gray." "But you will not leave me, Willie, until you have given me some clue to your unexpected arrival and to the strange questions you have been asking. Dinner is ready and can be served at once. Pray don't go out again until you have dined." She clung to my arm. It was evident that she considered me mad and thought it probable that I might make away with myself. This I could not bear. As for eating any dinner, that was simply impossible in my then frame of mind, although I had not tasted food since leaving Rochester. I resolved to tell her all. I resumed my seat. She placed herself on a stool at my feet and listened while I told her that all that I have set down as happening to me subsequently to my last letter to her from Melbourne. "And now, Alice, you know why I wish to see Johnny Gray." She would have accompanied me, but I thought better to prosecute my inquiries alone. I promised to return sometime during the night and tell her the result of my interview with Gray. That gentleman had married and become a householder on his own account during my absence in Australia. Alice knew his address and gave me the number of his house, which was on Church Street. A few minutes' rapid walking brought me to his door. I had no great expectation of finding him at home, as I deemed it probable he had not returned from wherever he had been going when I met him, but I should be able to find out when he was expected, and would either wait or go in search of him. Fortune favored me for once, however, and he had returned more than an hour before. I was ushered into the drawing room, where I found him playing cribbage with his wife. "Why, Willie!" he exclaimed, advancing to welcome me. "This is kinder than I expected. I hardly looked for you before tomorrow. All the better. We had just been speaking of you. Ellen, this is my old friend, Willie Furlong, the returned convict, whose banishment you have oft heard me deplore." It's a joke, because he left for Australia, which was a convict colony. After exchanging brief courtesies with Miss Gray, I turned to her husband. Mrs. Gray, excuse me. It's kind of funny. It's the exact kind of joke that I expect from this guy, from what little I know of him. Johnny, did you notice anything remarkable about the old gentleman who was with me when we met on Young Street this evening? Old gentleman? Who? There was no one with you when I met you. Think again. He and I were walking arm in arm, and you had passed us before you recognized me and mentioned my name. He looked hard in my face for a moment and then said positively, You are wrong, Willie. You were certainly alone when we met. You were walking slowly, and I must have noticed if anyone had been with you. It is you who are wrong, I retorted almost sternly. I was accompanied by an elderly gentleman who wore a great coat with a fur collar and cuffs, and we were conversing earnestly together when you passed us. He hesitated an instant and seemed to consider. It's a ghost. But there was no shade of doubt on his face. Have it your way, old boy, he said. All I can say is that I saw no one but yourself, and neither did Charlie Leach, who was with me. After parting from you, we commented on your evident abstraction and the somber expression of your countenance, which we attributed to you having only recently heard of the sudden death of your Uncle Richard. If any old gentleman had been with you, we could not possibly have failed to notice him. Without a single word by way of explanation or apology, I jumped from my seat, passed out into the hall, seized my hat, and left the house. Goodness. Yeah, I guess it's a ghost. We're definitely supposed to think it's a ghost. What if Johnny's in on it? I mean, it's a joke in very poor taste if it's a joke. Okay. Out into the street I rushed like a madman, banging the door after me. I knew that Johnny would follow me for an explanation, so I ran like lightning round the next corner and thence down to Young Street. Then I dropped to a walk, regained my breath, and asked myself what I should do next. Suddenly, I bethought me of Dr. Marston, an old friend of my uncle's. He hasn't been mentioned at all, has he? I don't think so. I hailed a passing cab and drove to his house. The doctor was in his consultation room and alone. Of course, he was surprised to see me and gave explanation to some appropriate words of sympathy to my bereavement. But how is it that I see you so soon? He asked. I understand that you were not expected for some months to come. Then I began my story, which I related with great circumstantiality of detail. I guess that's why he remembers all these details, because in this one moment, he had to repeat it like 5 or 6 times. Maybe more. Bringing it down to the moment of my arrival at his house, he listened with the closest attention, never interrupting me by a single exclamation until I had finished. Then he began to ask questions, some of which I thought strangely irrelevant. Have you enjoyed your usual good health during your residence abroad? Never better in my life. I have not had a moment's illness since you last saw me. And how have you prospered in your business enterprises? Reasonably well. But pray, doctor, let us confine ourselves to the matter at hand. I have come for friendly, not professional advice. All in time, my boy. All in good time, my boy, he calmly remarked. This was tantalizing. My strange narrative did not seem to have disturbed his serenity in the least degree. Did you have a pleasant passage? He asked after a brief pause. The ocean, I believe, is generally rough at this time of year. I mean, I think he just thinks that our protagonist he thinks Willie's gone off his rocker. Maybe he had like some bad business deals or something, and he's just a little unhinged, and he's just sort of either making up stuff or seeing things. I felt a little squeamish for a day or two after leaving Melbourne, I replied, but as soon as I got over it, it was not very bad even while it lasted. I am a tolerably good sailor. Oh, la-di-da. And you have had no special ground of anxiety as of late? At least not until you received this wonderful letter, he added, with a perceptible contraction of his lips as though trying to repress a smile. Then I saw what he was driving at. Doctor, I exclaimed with some exasperation in my voice, pray dismiss from your mind the idea that what I have told you is the result of diseased imagination. I am as sane as you are. The letter itself affords sufficient evidence that I am not quite such a fool as you take me for. My dear boy, I don't take you for a fool at all, though you are just a little excited. You are a little excited just at present. But I thought you said you returned the letter to, your uncle. For a moment, I had forgotten that important fact. But I was not altogether without evidence, and I had not been the victim of a disordered brain. My friend Gridley would corroborate to the receipt of the letter and its contents. My cousin could bear witness that I had displayed an acquaintance with facts that I would not have been likely to learn from anyone but my uncle. I had referred to his wig and overcoat, and had mentioned to her the name of Mr. Marcus Weatherly, a name which I had never heard before in my life. I called Dr. Mardson's attention to these matters and asked him to explain them if he could. I admit, said the doctor, that I don't quite see my way to a satisfactory explanation just at present, but let us look at the matter squarely in the face. During an acquaintance of nearly 30 years, I have always found your uncle to be a truthful man who was cautious enough to make no statements about his neighbors that he was not able to prove. Your informant, on the other hand, does not seem to have confined himself to facts. He made a charge of forgery against a gentleman whose moral and commercial integrity are unquestioned by all who know him. I know Marcus Weatherby pretty well, and am not disposed to pronounce him a forger and a scoundrel upon the unsupported evidence of a shadowy old gentleman who appears and disappears in the most mysterious manner, and who cannot be laid hold of and held responsible for his slander in the court of law. And it is not true, as far as I know and believe, that Marcus Weatherly is embarrassed in his circumstances. Such confidence have I in his solvency and integrity that I would not be afraid to take up all his outstanding paper without asking a question. If you will make inquiry, you will find that my opinion is shared by all the bankers in the city. I have no hesitation in saying that you will find no acceptances with your uncle's name to them, either in the market or elsewhere. I mean, well, so the only people who've gotten the full story are his cousin and the doctor. His cousin, I don't think she's like really had enough time to talk to him because he kind of just left. So maybe that's what she's thinking. We don't know. I guess the doctor is sort of like a man of science kind of deal. That seems to be his archetype. He just immediately went to madness. That I will try to ascertain tomorrow, I replied. Meanwhile, Dr. Marsden, will you oblige your old friend's nephew by writing to Mr. Junius Gridley and asking him to acquaint you with the contents of the letter and the circumstances under which I received it? It seems an absurd thing to do, he said, but I will if you like. What shall I say? And he sat down at his desk to write the letter. It was written in less than 5 minutes. I simply asked for the desired information and requested an immediate reply. Below the doctor's signature, I added a short postscript in these words. My story about the letter and its contents is discredited. Pray answer fully and at once. WFF. At my request, the doctor accompanied me to the post office on Toronto Street and dropped the letter into the box with his own hands. I bade him good night and repaired to the Rosen house. I did not feel like encountering Alice again until I could place myself in a more satisfactory light before her. I dispatched the Rosen house. Which one was the Rosen house? I dispatched a message to her with a short note stating that I had not discovered anything important and requesting her not to wait up for me. Then, it's just a hotel. Then I engaged a room and went to bed. But not to sleep. All night long, I tossed about from one side of the bed to the other, and at daylight, feverish and unrefreshed, I strolled out. I returned in time for breakfast, but ate little or nothing. I longed for the arrival of 10 o'clock when the banks would open. After breakfast, I sat down at the reading room of the hotel and vainly tried to fix my attention upon the local columns of the morning paper. I remember reading over several items time after time without any comprehension of their meaning. After that, I remember nothing. Nothing? All was blank for more than 5 weeks. When consciousness came back to me, I found myself in bed in my own old room in the house on Gerrard Street, and Alice and Dr. Marsden were standing by my bedside. No need to tell how my hair had been removed, nor about the bags of ice that had been applied to my head. No need to linger over any of the details of the pitiless fever that burned in my brain. No need either to linger over my progress back to convalescence, and thence to complete recovery. In a week from the time I had mentioned, I was permitted to sit up in bed, propped up by a mountain of pillows. My patience would brook no further delay, and I was allowed to ask questions about what had happened in the interval which had elapsed, since my overwrought nerves gave way to the prolonged strain upon them. Yeah, now the details aren't important. Well, they shaved his head. I think he just doesn't want to talk about it. First, Junius Gridley's letter in reply to Dr. Marsden was placed in my hands. I still have it in my possession, and I transcribed the following copy from the original, now lying before me. Boston, December 22nd, 1861. Dr. Marsden, in reply to your letter, which had just been received, I have to say that Mr. Furlong and myself became acquainted for the first time during our recent passage from Liverpool to Boston in the Persia, which arrived here Monday last. Mr. Furlong accompanied me home and remained until Tuesday morning, when I took him to see the public library, the State House, the Athenaeum, the Faneuil Hall, and other points of interest. We casually dropped into the post office, and he remarked upon the great number of letters there. At my instigation, made, of course, in jest, he applied at the general delivery for letters for himself. He received one bearing the Toronto postmark. He received one bearing the Toronto postmark. He was naturally very surprised at receiving it, and was not less so at the contents. After receiving it, he handed it to me, and I also read it carefully. I cannot recollect it word for word, but it professed to come from his affectionate uncle, Richard Yardington. He expressed pleasure at his coming home sooner than having been anticipated, and hinted in rather vague terms at some calamity. He referred to a lady called Alice, and stated that she had not been informed of Mr. Furlong's intended arrival. There was something, too, about his presence at home being a recompense for her recent grief which she had sustained. It was also expressed in the writer's intention to meet his nephew at the Toronto railway station upon his arrival, and stated that no telegram need be sent. This, as nearly as I can remember, was about all there was in the letter. Mr. Furlong professed to recognize the handwriting as his uncle's. It was a cramped hand, not easy to read, and the signature was so peculiarly formed that I had hardly been able to decipher it. The peculiarity consisted of the extreme irregularity of the formation of the letters, no two of which were of equal size, and capitals were interspersed promiscuously, more especially throughout the surname. Mr. Furlong was much agitated at the contents of the letter, and was anxious for the arrival of the time of his departure. He left by the B&A train at 11:30, and this is really all I know about the matter, and I have been anxiously expecting to hear from him ever since he left. I confess I feel curious, and I should be glad to hear from him, that is, of course, unless something is involved where it would be impertinent for a comparative stranger to pry into. Yours in company, Junius H. Gridley. So that, my friend, has completely corroborated my account so far as the letter was concerned. My account, however, stood in no need of corroboration, as will presently appear. When I was stricken down, Alice and Dr. Marsden were the only persons to whom I communicated what my uncle said to me during our walk from the station. They both maintained silence in the matter, except to each other. Between themselves, in the early days of my illness, they discussed it with a good deal of feeling on each side. Alice implicitly believed my story from first to last. She was wise enough to see that I had been made acquainted with matters I could not have I could not possibly have learned through any ordinary channels of communication. In short, she was not so enamored of professional jargon as to have lost her common sense. Ooh, got 'em! The doctor, however, with the mole blindness of many of his tribe, refused to believe. Why does this guy hate doctors? Nothing of this kind had previously come within range of his own experience, and it was therefore impossible. He accounted for it all upon the hypothesis of my impending fever. He is not the only physician who mistakes cause for effect, and vice versa. The quacks, all of them. Well, I mean, that's a fair point, Greasy. I mean, that's yeah. I mean, yes, doctors at the time. He's kind of lucky that didn't end up happening to him. During the second week of my prostration, Mr. Marcus Weatherly absconded. This event so totally unlooked by those who had dealings with him, at once brought his financial condition to light. It was found that he had been really insolvent for several months past. The day after his departure, a number of his acceptances became due. These acceptances proved to be four in number, accounting to exactly $42,000. So that part of my uncle's story was confirmed. One of the acceptances was payable in Montreal and was for $2,283.76. The other three were payable at different banks in Toronto. These last had been drawn at 60 days, and each of them bore a signature presumed to be that of Richard Yardington. One of them was for $8,972.11, and another was for $10,114.63, and the third and last was for $20,629.50. A short sum and simple addition will show us the aggregate of these three amounts. Which was the amount for which my uncle claimed that his name had been forged. Dab noise. Within a week after these things came to light, a letter addressed to the manager of one of the leading bank institutions in Toronto arrived from Mr. Marcus Weatherly. He wrote from New York, but stated he should leave there within an hour from the time of posting his letter. He voluntarily admitted having forged the name of my uncle to the three acceptances above referred to, and entered into other details about his affairs. Which why is he just offering this up? Which, though interesting enough to his creditors at that time, would have no special interest to the public at present day. The banks where the acceptances had been discounted were wise after the fact, and detected numerous little details wherein the forged signatures differed from the genuine signatures of my Uncle Richard. In each case, they pocketed the loss and held their tongues, and I dare say they will not thank me for calling attention to the matter, even at this distance of time. Jesus. There is not much more to tell. Marcus Weatherly, the forger, met his fate within a few days after writing his letter from New York. He took passage at New Bedford, Massachusetts, in a sailing vessel called the Petrel, bound for Havana. The Petrel sailed from port on the 12th of January, 1862, and went down in mid-ocean with all hands on the 23rd of the same month. She sank in full sight of the captain and crew of the city of Baltimore, Inman Lion. So the ship is called the City of Baltimore. But the hurricane prevailing was such that the latter was unable to render any assistance or to save one of the ill-fated crew from the fury of the waves. At an early stage in the story, I mentioned that the only fictitious element should be the name of one of the characters introduced. The name is that of Marcus Weatherly himself. The person who I am so designated really bore a different name, one that is still remembered by scores of people in Toronto. He has paid the penalty of his misdeeds, and I see nothing to be gained by perpetuating them in connection to his own proper name. Why not? In all other just looking after the reputation of another rich guy? In all other particulars, the foregoing narrative is as true as a tolerably retentive memory. I mean, maybe he just doesn't want to get sued for libel or something. Has enabled me to record it. I don't propose to attempt any psychological examination of the events here recorded, for the very sufficient reason that only one explanation is possible. The weird letter and its contents, as has been seen, do not rest upon my testimony alone. With respect to my walk from the station here with Uncle Richard, and the communication made here by him to me, and all the details are as real to my mind as any other incidents of my life. The only obvious deduction is that I was made a recipient of a communication of the kind which the world is accustomed to regard as supernatural. Oh my god, I'm fucking rolling my eyes. Mr. Owen's publishers have my full permission to appropriate this story in the next edition of his Debatable Land Between This World and the Next. Should they do so, their readers will doubtless be favored with an elaborate analysis of the facts, with a pseudo-philosophic theory about spiritual communion with human beings. My wife, who is an enthusiastic student of electrobiology, is disposed to believe that Weatherly's mind, overweighted by the knowledge of his forgery, was in some occult manner, and unconsciously to himself, constrained to act upon my own senses. I'm I prefer, however, to simply to narrate the facts. I may or may not have my own theory about those facts. The reader is at perfect liberty to form one of his own if he so pleases. I may mention that Dr. Marsden professes to believe to the present day that my mind was disordered by the approach of the fever, which eventually struck me down, and that all I have described was merely the result of what he, with delightful paraphrasis, calls an abnormal condition of the system induced by... Oh wait, now he kind of was the Boston guy. Induced by causes too... I lost his voice, so now he's that guy from Rocky and Bullwinkle. An abnormal condition of the system introduced by causes too remote for specific diagnosis. It will be observed that, whether I was under a hallucination or not, the information supposed to be derived from my uncle was strictly accurate in all its details. The fact that the disclosure subsequently became unnecessary through the confession of Weatherly does not seem to me to afford any argument for the hallucination theory. My uncle's communication was important at the time when it was given to me, and we have no reason for believing that those who are gone before are universally gifted with a knowledge of the future. It was so open to me to make the facts public as soon as they became known to me, and had I done so, Marcus Weatherly might have been arrested and punished for his crime. Had not my illness supervened, I should have made discoveries in the course of the day following my arrival in Toronto that would have led to his arrest. Yeah, he's Snaggletooth. That's not Boston guy. I couldn't remember my voice for the doctor, so now he's Snaggletooth. Such speculations are profitless enough, but they have often formed the topic of discussion between my wife and myself. Gridley, too, whenever he pays us a visit, invariably revives the subject with which he long ago christened the Gerrard Street Mystery, though it might just as well be called the Yonge Street Mystery or the Mystery of the Union Station. He has urged me 100 times over to publish the story, and now, after all these years, I follow his counsel and adopt his nomenclature in the title. Okay, that is it. That is the Gerrard Street Mystery. Woo! The end. Goodness, I'm gonna take a quick break, and then we'll have a little chat about that. Yeah, that was pretty good. I kind of flipped around on it about halfway through. It really brought it home. I guess I feel like the ending is just a little weak, but I guess it's sort of hard to like bring something like this. Oh yeah. It beats the shit out of Cock Lane. Well, that was all very important, Tony. We needed that preamble. And I would like to make one correction. That was not Snagglepuss's voice. That was the voice of Captain Peter Wrongway Peach Fuzz from Rocky and Bullwinkle. You know, that ship captain who never knew what he was doing. He was a real buffoon. Yeah. Jesus. Yeah, okay, so you never seen Rocky and Bullwinkle? Oh man, it's good except for the really racist parts. Um, those don't hold up that great. We'll have to maybe have a watch night for it sometime. The parts that are good are good. The parts that are bad are quiche. Yeah, Choose Goose is like, I feel like a direct sort of like allusion to that voice. There was a voice actor at the time whose name is, now I'm gonna look at his voice actor's name, but he sort of just had, that was one of his voices that he did. Paul Frees. Who did a lot of different voice acting. Yeah, exactly. That's what I said. That's what I said, Kersey. That's going on the books. All right, so what do you guys think? I'm going to make a proposition now. What if we were to continue? There are, I believe, I'm trying to scroll up on the preview. That's no good. There are, I believe, 4 more stories here. Yes, the Gerrard Street Mystery, Gagtooth's Image, The Haunted House on Duchess Street, and Saverine's Disappearance. So we got 3 more stories. I'll tell you what, while we are continuing to bust through the house on the Borderland, what if we open up, not tonight. What if we open up our reading with another one of these? I feel like these are pretty high energy too. And very fun, and maybe a little lighthearted to alternate, so we're not spending several hours reading the spooky spooks times. Yes, okay. I thought you guys might like that. Let me see here. Oh dang, we actually got quite a few people listening in. Hey, I do want to say, anybody who does not currently follow me, if you guys want to drop a follow, I would super appreciate it. I'm trying to get up to 50 so that I can get affiliate, and then we can do all kinds of fun stuff with like bits and whatnot. And like I got plans to like spruce up stream for like video game time. Oh, somebody left. Damn. They ditched before they had any responsibility. I mean, just also, I'm having a lot of fun reading these, so I'm definitely going to keep this up. And anybody you guys could share this to, I'd super appreciate it. What was what question? The first question was whether I should read one of these mysteries before digging into House on the Borderland every week, and I think at least Tony's enthusiastic about that. The other question was just a reminder, like a little call. I feel awkward about these, so I'm just going to call it a call to action. Like anybody you guys could share this with. I'm trying to build up my followers here so that I can meet the minimum threshold for affiliate. That was the second thing. I really appreciate it. But oh yeah, speaking of which, Tony, you missed out this Friday. There was a perfect game for you on the thing. I'm gonna have the VOD of it up on YouTube soon. I guess the VOD's up on Twitch, but I respect that as a depressed weenie myself. Yeah, it was like, oh gosh, oh no, all of my rabbits are gone. And it's this big sort of puzzle game where you have all the rabbits and you're a cute girl and you go around calling to the rabbits and telling them to move to solve puzzles. Yeah, it's really good. And it's also much bigger than I thought it was. We only got like halfway through it. I wasn't expecting to go all the way through it, but I think probably this Friday we're going to finish it up. But yeah, I respect that. And listen, if all they can do is like come by and drop me a follow, that's technically all I need. Not to be, like manipulative or like whatever. I'm trying to get them followers, dog. I don't feel bad. The VODs are going to go up. They're going to be up on Twitch for however long those last. But I'll be uploading them to my YouTube channel after I get them all like sort of cut up and like edited and making them sound nicer. So you don't have to miss out. It'll be there. I'll even link you the video whenever it goes up on YouTube so you can watch it. I think you'll really appreciate it. It's underneath my stream here. I think. Let me like double check that everything is working with that. Yeah, the Kirby little Kirby YouTube thing. That is click that for the link. That is maybe not the most obvious, but like, oh, thank you. I don't see any reason to change that. Okay. I'm taking a little sip here. As it stands, the VOD for last week's just got premiered this morning on YouTube, so like I'm gonna try at least I know you are, and I appreciate it. I'm gonna try to get like everything at least like a week behind. I'm probably gonna like cut up Journey to a Strange Planet into like smaller chunks, probably like 30 minutes or so, just to make it a little bit more watchable, rather than being, because we streamed that for like 5 hours. Okay, but how's about we get into A House on the Borderlands? I'm taking another sip of water. I'm like dried out over here. Yay! Presumably now the voice is that of an Irishman. He's living in here, unless he's just still British, living in like the middle of Ireland for some reason, which is entirely possible. But now we're in. If y'all remember, we sort of followed our, not even the author, because I believe it was. Hold on. Was from the manuscript discovered by Messrs. Tonneson and Beregnog, which is our point of view character here. In the ruins that lie to the south of the village of Creighton, to the west in the west of Ireland, set out here with notes. So we followed Tonneson and Beregnog on their little fishing trip, and then shenanigans. Spooky shenanigans. Well, I think Borderland, it's a Borderland, so it's like on the border of two realities. That's how I interpreted it based on what I knew about it going in. Yeah, I have no idea if I'm saying that fellow's name right. That's just a guess. Okay. So we're on chapter 2, The Plane of Silence. Ooh. Oh, well, maybe? Well, this was before the split, right? I'm probably making a fool of myself with that question. Okay, so that wasn't, I had no idea how recent that was. Well, this was written in 1908? I can double check that. Well, it's discovered in 1877. So still pre. So that is not sort of that's not some kind of like underlying meaning that we're meant to take here, I guess. Anyway, so chapter 2, The Plane of Silence. I am an old man. I live here in this ancient house, surrounded by huge, unkempt gardens. The peasantry, who inhabit the wilderness beyond, say that I am mad. That is because I will have nothing to do with them. I live here alone with my old sister, who is also my housekeeper. We keep no servants. I hate them. I have one friend, a dog. Yes, I would sooner have old Pepper than the rest of creation together. He, at least, understands me, and has sense enough to leave me alone when I am in my dark moods. I have decided to start a kind of diary. It may enable me to record some of the thoughts and feelings that I cannot express to anyone, but beyond this, I am anxious to make some record of the strange things that I have heard and seen during many years of loneliness in this weird old building. For a couple of centuries, this house has had a reputation, a bad one, and, until I bought it, for more than 80 years no one had lived here. Consequently, I got the old palace at a ridiculously low figure. I mean, I don't think this guy's got any friends. Not even the dog's really his friend. He calls him his friend, but I don't buy it. I am not superstitious, but I have ceased to deny that things happen in this old house, things that I cannot explain, and, therefore, I must needs... Ooh, he said the thing. I must needs ease my mind by writing down an account of them, to the best of my ability. Though, should this, my diary, ever be read when I am gone, the readers will but shake their heads and be the more convinced I was mad. He said the Final Fantasy phrase, everybody clap. This house, how ancient it is. Though its age strikes one less, perhaps, than the quaintness of its structure, which is curious and fantastic to the last degree. Little curved towers and pinnacles with outlies suggesting of leaping flames predominant, while the body of the building is in the form of a circle. I have heard that there is an old story told amongst the country people to the effect that the devil built the place. However, that is as may be. True or not, I neither know nor care, save as it may have helped to cheapen it ere I came. I must have been here some 10 years before I saw sufficient to warrant any belief in the stories current in the neighborhood about this house. It is true that I had, on at least a dozen occasions, seen, vaguely, things that puzzled me, and, perhaps, have felt more than I had seen. Then, as the years passed, bringing age upon me, I became often aware of something unseen, yet unmistakably present in the empty rooms and corridors. Still, it was as I had said many years before I saw any real manifestation. Still, it was, as I have said, many years... He didn't put commas around that bit, so it threw me. Many years before I saw any real manifestations of the so-called supernatural. It was not Halloween. If I were telling a story for amusement's sake, I should probably place it on that night of nights. But this is a true record of my own experiences, and I would not put pen to paper to amuse anyone. No. It was after midnight on the morning of the 21st day of January. I was sitting reading, as is often my custom, in my study, Pepper lay sleeping near my chair. Without warning, the flames of the 2 candles went low, and then shone with a ghastly green effulgence. I looked up quickly, and as I did so, saw the lights shrink into a dull, ruddy tint, so that the room glowed with a strange, heavy crimson twilight that gave the shadows behind the chairs and tables a double depth of blackness. And wherever the light struck, it was as though luminous blood had been splashed over the room. Yeah, this guy's really, really proud of his own, internal monologue, but I guess it's all he's got. Down on the floor, I heard a faint, frightened whimper, and something pressed itself between my 2 feet. It was Pepper, cowering under my dressing gown. Pepper, usually brave as a lion. It was this movement of the dog's, I think, that gave me the first twinge of real fear. I had been considerably startled when the lights burnt first green and then red, but had been momentarily under the impression that the change was due to some influx of noxious gas into the room. Now, however, I saw that it was not so, for the candles burned with a steady flame and showed no signs of going out, as would have been the case had the change been due to the fumes in the atmosphere. I did not move. I felt distinctly frightened, but could think of nothing better to do than wait. For perhaps a minute, I kept my glance about the room nervously. Then I noticed that the lights had commenced to sink very slowly, until presently they showed minute specks of red fire, like the gleamings of rubies in the darkness. Still, I sat watching, while a sort of dreamy indifference seemed to steal over me, banishing altogether the fear that had begun to grip me. Away in the far end of the huge, old-fashioned room, I became conscious of a faint glow. Steadily it grew, filling the room with gleams of quivering green light. Then they sank quickly and changed, even as the candle flames had done, into a deep, somber crimson that strengthened and lit up the room with a flood of awful glory. The light came from the end wall and grew ever brighter until its intolerable glare caused my eyes acute pain, and involuntarily I closed them. It may have been a few seconds before I was able to open them. The first thing I noticed was that the light had decreased greatly, so that it no longer tried my eyes. Then, as it grew still duller, I was aware, all at once, that instead of looking at the redness, I was staring through it, and through the wall beyond. Gradually, as I became more accustomed to the idea, I realized that I was looking out onto a vast plain, lit with the same gloomy twilight that pervaded the room. The immensity of this plain scarcely can be conceived. In no part could I perceive its confines. It seemed to broaden and spread out so that the eye failed to perceive any limitations. Slowly, the details of the nearer portions began to grow clear. Then, in a moment almost, the light died away, and the vision, if vision it were, faded and was gone. Suddenly, I became conscious that I was no longer in the chair. Instead, I seemed to be hovering above it and looking down at a dim something huddled and silent. In a little while, a cold blast struck me, and I was outside in the night, floating like a bubble up through the darkness. As I moved, an icy coldness seemed to enfold me, so that I shivered. After a time, I looked to the right and left, and saw the intolerable blackness of the night, pierced by remote gleams of fire. Onward and outward I drove. Once I glanced behind and saw the earth, a small crescent of blue light receding away from my left. Further off, the sun, a splash of white flame, burned vividly against the dark. I went to space. An indefinite period passed. Then, for the last time, I saw the earth, an enduring globule of radiant blue, swimming in an eternity of ether. And there I, a fragile flake of soul dust, flickered silently across the void, from the distant blue into the expanse of the unknown. A great while seemed to pass over me, and now I could nowhere see anything. I had passed beyond the fixed stars and plunged into the huge blackness that ways beyond. All this time I had experienced little, save a sense of lightness and cold discomfort. Now, however, the atrocious darkness seemed to creep into my soul, and I became filled with fear and despair. What was going to become of me? Where was I going? Even as the thoughts were formed, they grew against the impalpable blackness and wrapped me in a faint tinge of blood. It seemed extraordinarily remote and mist-like, yet at once the feeling of oppression was lightened, and I no longer despaired. Slowly the distant redness became plainer and larger until I drew nearer. It spread out into a great somber glare, dull and tremendous. Still, I fled onward, and presently I had come so close that it seemed to stretch beneath me like a great ocean of somber red. I could see little save that it appeared to spread out interminably in all directions. In a further space, I found that I was descending upon it, and soon I sank into a great sea of sullen, red-hued clouds. Slowly I emerged from these, and there, below me, I saw the stupendous plain that I had seen from my room in this house that stands upon the borders of the silences. Presently I landed and stood, surrounded by a great waste of loneliness. The place was lit with a gloomy twilight that gave me an impression of indescribable desolation. Afar to my right, within the sky, there burnt a gigantic ring of dull red fire, from the outer edge of which were projected huge, writhing flames, darted and jagged. In the interior of this ring was black as the gloom of the outer night. I comprehended at once that it was from this extraordinary sun that the place derived its doleful light. From that strange source of light, I glanced down to my surroundings. Everywhere I looked, I saw nothing but the same flat weariness of interminable plain. Nowhere could I descry any signs of life, not even the ruins of some ancient habitation. Gradually, I found I was being borne forward, floating across the flat waste. For what seemed an eternity, I moved onward. I was unaware of any great sense of impatience, though some curiosity and a vast wonder were with me continually. Always I saw around me in the breadth of that enormous plain, and always I searched for some new thing to break its monotony, but there was no change, only loneliness, silence, and desert. Presently, in a half-conscious manner, I noticed there was a faint mistiness, ruddy in hue, lying over its surface. Still, when I looked more intently, I was unable to say that it was really mist, for it appeared to be blended with the plain, giving it a peculiar unrealness and conveying to the senses the idea of unsustainability. Gradually, I began to weary with the sameness of the thing. Yet, it was a great time before I perceived any signs of the place, toward which I was being conveyed. At first, I saw it, far up ahead like a long hillock on the surface of the plain. Then, as I drew nearer, I perceived that I had been mistaken, for instead of a low hill, I made out now a chain of great mountains, whose distant peaks towered up into the red gloom until they were almost lost to sight. That part was in quotes for some reason. I mean, aliens, beings from beyond, were sort of like in a... He described going past to the stars, so we're not dealing with, conventional modern cosmology. That much is for sure. Chapter 3, The House in the Area. The House in the Arena. And so, after a time, I came to the mountains. Then the course of my journey was altered, and I began to move along their bases until all at once I saw that I had come opposite to a vast rift opening into the mountains. Through this I was borne, moving at no great speed. On either side of me, huge scarped walls of rock-like substance rose sheer. Far overhead I discerned a thin ribbon of red where the mouth of the chasm opened among inaccessible peaks. Within was gloom, deep and somber and chilly silence. For a while I went onward steadily, and then, at last, I saw, ahead, a deep red glow that told me I was near upon the further opening of the gorge. Yeah, I'm really loving the sort of like the painting that is being made with the words here. A minute came and went, and I was at the exit of the chasm, staring out upon an enormous amphitheater of mountains. Yet of the mountains and the terrible grandeur of the place, I reckoned nothing. For I was confounded with amazement to behold at a distance of several miles and occupying the center of the arena a stupendous structure built apparently of green jade. Yet in itself it was not the discovery of the building that had so astonished me, but the fact, which became every moment more apparent, that in no particular, save in color and its enormous size, did the lonely structure vary from this house in which I live. For a while I continued to stare fixedly. Even then I could scarcely believe that I saw aright. In my mind a question formed, reiterating incessantly, "What does it mean? What does it mean?" And I was unable to answer, even out of the depths of my imagination. I seemed capable only of wonder and fear. For a time longer I gazed, noting continually some fresh point of resemblance that attracted me. At last, wearied and sorely puzzled, I turned from it, to view the rest of the strange place on which I had intruded. Hitherto I had been so engrossed in my scrutiny of the house that I had given only a cursory glance round. Now, as I looked, I began to realize upon what sort of place I had come. The arena, for so I had termed it, appeared perfectly circular, of about 10 to 12 miles in diameter, the house, as I have mentioned before, standing in the center. The surface of the place, like to that of the plain, had a peculiar misty appearance that was yet not mist. From a rapid survey, my glance passed quickly upward along the slopes of the circling mountains. How silent they were! I think that this same abominable stillness was more trying to me than anything that I had seen so far, seen or imagined. I was looking up now at the great crags, towering so loftily. Up here, the impalpable redness gave a blurred appearance to everything. And then I peered curiously. A new terror came to me. For away up among the dim peaks to my right, I had descried a vast shape of blackness, giant-like. It grew upon my sight. It had an enormous equine head with gigantic ears, and seemed to peer steadfastly down into the arena. There was that about the pose that gave me the impression of an eternal watchfulness, of having warded that dismal place through unknown eternities. Slowly the monster became plainer to me, and then, suddenly, my gaze sprang from it to something further off and higher among the crags. For a long minute I gazed fearfully. I was strangely conscious of something not altogether unfamiliar, as though something stirred in the back of my mind. The thing was black and had 4 grotesque arms. The features showed indistinctly round the neck, and I made out several light-colored objects. Slowly the details came to me, and I realized, coldly, that they were skulls. Further down the body was another circling belt, showing less dark against the black trunk. Then, even as I puzzled to know what the thing was, a memory slid into my mind, and straightway I knew that I was looking at a monstrous representation of Kali, the Hindu goddess of death. Oh boy, I can't judge based on that alone, but I hope we're not in for more than just Irish racism. Yeah, same. Other resemblance of my old student days drifted into my thoughts. My glance fell back upon the huge beast-headed thing. Simultaneously, I recognized it for the ancient Egyptian goddess Set, or Seth, the destroyer of souls. With the knowledge, there came the great sweep of questioning. I stopped and endeavored to think. Things beyond my imagination peered into my frightened mind. I saw, obscurely, the old gods of mythology. I tried to comprehend to what I was all pointing. My gaze dwelt flickeringly between the two. An idea came swiftly, and I turned and glanced rapidly upward, searching the gloomy crags away to my left. Something loomed out under a great peak, a shape of grayness. I wondered I had not seen it earlier, and then remembered I had not yet viewed that portion. I saw it more plainly now. It was, as I have said, gray. It had a tremendous head, but no eyes. That part of its face was blank. And now I saw there were other things up among the mountains, further off, reclining on a lofty ledge. I made out a livid mass, irregular and ghoulish. It seemed without form save for an unclean, half-animal face that looked out vilely from somewhere around its middle. And then I saw others. There were hundreds of them. They seemed to grow out of the shadows. Several I recognized almost immediately as mythological deities. Others were strange to me, utterly strange, beyond the power of a human mind to conceive. On each side I looked and saw more, continually. The mountains were full of strange things, beast gods and horrors so atrocious and bestial that possibility and decency deny any further attempt to describe them. And I was filled with a terrible sense of overwhelming horror and fear and repugnance, yet in spite of these I wondered exceedingly. Was there then, after all, something in that old heathen worship? Something more than mere deifying of men, animals, and elements? The thought gripped me. Was there? Later, a question repeated itself. What were they, those beast gods and the others? At first, they appeared to me just sculpted monsters placed indiscriminately among the inaccessible peaks and precipices of the surrounding mountains. Now, as I scrutinized them with greater intentness, my mind began to reach out to fresh conclusions. There was something about them, an indescribable sort of silent vitality that suggested to my broadening consciousness a state of life and death. Something that was by no means life as we understand it, but rather an inhuman form of existence that might well be likened to a deathless trance, a condition in which it was possible to imagine their continuing eternality. Immortal, the word rose into my thoughts unbidden, and, straight away, I grew to wondering whether this might be the immortality of the gods. And then, in the midst of my wondering and musing, something happened. Until then, I had been staying just within the shadow of the exit of the Great Rift. Now, without volition on my part, I drifted out of the semi-darkness and began to move slowly across the arena toward the house. At this, I gave up all thoughts of those prodigious shapes above me, and could only stare frightenedly at the tremendous structure toward which I was being conveyed so remorselessly. Yet, though I searched as earnestly, I could discover nothing that I had not already seen, and so became gradually calmer. Presently, I had reached a point more than halfway between the house and the gorge. All around was spread the stark loneliness of the place and the unbroken silence. Steadily I neared the great building. Then, all at once, something caught my vision. Something that came round one of the huge buttresses of the house and so into full view. It was a gigantic thing, and moved with a curious lope, going almost upright, after the manner of a man. It was quite unclothed, and had a remarkable luminous appearance. Yet it was the face that attracted and frightened me the most. It was the face of a swine. So many adverbs and commas and semicolons. The man is fond of his interjections. Silently, intently, I watched this horrible creature and forgot my fear momentarily in my interest in its movements. It was making its way cumbrously round the building, stopping as it came to each window to peer in and shake at the bars with which, as is this house, they were protected. And whenever it came to a door, it would push at it, fingering the fastening stealthily. Evidently, it was searching for an ingress into the house. I had come now to within less than a quarter of a mile of the great structure, and still it was compelled forward. Abruptly, the thing turned and gazed hideously in my direction. It opened its mouth, and for the first time, the stillness of that abominable place was broken by a deep, booming note that sent an added thrill of apprehension through me. Then, immediately, I became aware that it was coming toward me, swiftly and silently. In an instant, it had covered half the distance that lay between, and still I was borne helplessly to meet it. Only 100 yards, and the brutish ferocity of the giant face numbed me with a feeling of unmitigated horror. I could have screamed in the supremeness of my fear, and then, in the very moment of my extremity and despair, I became conscious that I was looking down upon the arena from a rapidly increasing height. I was rising. In an inconceivably short while, I had reached an altitude of many hundred feet. Beneath me, the spot that I had just left was occupied by the foul swine creature. It had gone down on all fours and was snuffing and rooting like a veritable hog at the surface of the arena. A moment and it rose to its feet, clutching upward with an expression of desire upon its face such that I have never seen in this world. Continually, I mounted higher. A few minutes, it seemed, and I had risen above the great mountains, floating, alone, afar in the redness. At a tremendous distance below, the arena showed dimly, with the mighty house looking no larger than a tiny spot of green. The Swine-Thing was no longer visible. Presently, I passed over the mountains, out above the huge breadth of the plain. Far away on its surface, in the direction of the ring-shaped sun, there showed a confused blur. I looked toward it indifferently. It reminded me somewhat of the first glimpse I had caught of the mountain amphitheater. With a sense of weariness, I glanced upward at the immense ring of fire. What a strange thing it was! Then, as I stared out from the dark center, there spurted a sudden flare of extraordinarily vivid fire. Compared with the size of the black center, it was as naught, yet in itself stupendous. With an awakened interest, I watched it carefully, noting its strange boiling and glowing. Then, in a moment, the whole thing grew dim and unreal, and so passed out of sight. Much amazed, I glanced down at the plain from which I was still rising. Thus, I received a fresh surprise. The plain, everything, had vanished, and only a sea of red mist was spread far below me. Gradually, as I stared, this grew remote and died away into a dim, far mystery of red against an unfathomable night. And while even this had gone, I was wrapped in an impalpable, lightless gloom. Chapter 4. The Earth. Thus I was, and only the memory that I had lived through such a dark, once before, served to sustain my thoughts. A great time passed, ages, and then a single star broke its way through the darkness. It was the first of one of the outlying clusters of this universe. Presently it was far behind, and all about me shone the splendor of the countless stars. Later, years it seemed, I saw the sun, a clot of flame. Around it, I made out presently several remote specks of light, the planets of the solar system. And so I saw the Earth again, blue and unbelievably minute. It grew larger and became more defined. A long space of time came and went, and then at last I entered into the shadow of the world, plunging headlong into the dim and holy Earth night. Overhead were the constellations, and there was a crescent moon. Then, as I neared the Earth's surface, a dimness swept over me, and I appeared to sink into a black mist. For a while, I knew nothing. I was unconscious. Gradually, I became aware of a faint, distant whining. It became plainer. A desperate feeling of agony possessed me. I struggled madly for breath and tried to shout. A moment, and I got my breath more easily. I was conscious that something was licking my hand. Something damp swept across my face. I heard a panting, and then again a whining. It seemed to come from my ears now with a sense of familiarity, and I opened my eyes. All was dark, but the feeling of oppression had left me. I was seated, and something was whining piteously and licking me. I felt strangely confused and instinctively tried to ward off the thing that licked me. My head was curiously vacant, and for the moment I seemed incapable of action or thought. Then things came back to me, and I called, "Pepper, faintly. I was answered by a joyful bark and renewed and frantic caresses. In a little while I felt stronger and put out my hand for the matches. I groped around for a few moments, blindly, then my hands lit upon them and I struck a light. I looked confusingly around. All about me I saw the old familiar things, and I sat full of dazed wonders until the flame of the match burnt my finger and I dropped it, while a hasty expression of pain and anger escaped my lips, surprising me with the sound of my own voice. After a moment, I struck another match, and stumbling across the room, lit the candles. As I did so, I observed they had not burned away, but had been put out. As the flames shot up, I turned and stared about the study, yet there was nothing unusual to see, and suddenly a gust of irritation took me. What had happened? I held my head with both hands and tried to remember. The great silent plain, and the ring-shaped sun of red fire. Where were they? Where had I seen them? How long ago? I felt dazed and muddled. Once or twice I walked up and down the room unsteadily. My memory seemed dulled, and already the thing I had witnessed came back to me with an effort. I had a remembrance of cursing peevishly in my bewilderment. Suddenly, I turned faint and giddy and had to grasp at the table for support. During a few moments, I held on weakly and then managed to totter sideways into a chair. After a little time, I felt somewhat better and succeeded in reaching the cupboard where usually I kept brandy and biscuits. I poured myself a little of the stimulant and drank it off. Then, taking a handful of biscuits, I returned to my chair and began to devour them ravenously. I was vaguely surprised at my hunger. I felt as though I had eaten nothing for an uncountably long while. Me too, but unfortunately, I think he mentioned that he awoke in the chair. As I ate, my glance roved about the room, taking in its various details and still searching, though almost unconsciously, for something tangible upon which to take hold among the invisible mysteries that encompassed me. Surely, I thought, there must be something. And in the same instant, my gaze dwelt upon the face of the clock in the opposite corner. There within, I stopped eating and just stared. For though its ticking indicated most certainly that it was still going, the hands were pointing to a little before the hour of midnight, whereas it was, as well I knew, considerably after that time which I had witnessed the first of the strange things happening before I have just described. For perhaps a moment I was astounded and puzzled. Had the hour been the same as when I had last seen the clock? I should have concluded that the hands had struck in one place, while the internal mechanism went on as usual. But that would in no way account for the hands having traveled backward. Then, even as I turned the matter over in my wearied brain, the thought flashed upon me that it was now close upon the morning of the 22nd, and that I had been unconscious to the visible world through the greater portion of the last 24 hours. The thought occupied my attention for a full minute. Then I commenced to eat again. I was still very hungry. During breakfast next morning, I inquired casually of my sister regarding the date and found my surmise correct. I had, indeed, been absent, at least in spirit, for nearly a day and a night. My sister asked me no questions, for it is not by any means the first time that I have kept to my study for a whole day, and sometimes a couple of days at a time when I have been particularly engrossed in my books or work. And so the days pass on, and I am still filled with a wonder to know the meaning of all that I saw on that memorable night. Yet well I know my curiosity is little likely to be satisfied. Excuse me. Yeah, I mean, it really ramps up after that first chapter. Chapter 5, The Thing in the Pit. The house is, as I have said before, surrounded by a huge estate and wild, uncultivated gardens. Away at the back, distant some 300 yards, is a dark, deep ravine, spoken of as the pit by the peasantry. At the bottom runs a sluggish stream so overhung by trees as scarcely to be seen from above. In passing, I must explain that this river had a subterranean origin, emerging suddenly at the east end of the ravine and disappearing as abruptly beneath the cliffs that form its western extremity. It was some months after my vision, if vision it were, of the great plain, that my attention was particularly attracted to the pit. I happened one day to be walking along its southern edge when, suddenly, several pieces of rock and shale were dislodged from the face of the cliff immediately beneath me, and fell with a sullen crash through the trees. I heard them splatter in the river at the bottom, and then silence. I should not have given this incident more than a passing thought had not Pepper at once begun to bark savagely, nor would he be silent when I bade him, which is most unusual behavior on his part. Feeling that there must be someone or something in the pit, I went back to the house quickly for a stick. When I returned, Pepper had ceased his barking, and was growling and smelling uneasily along the top. Whistling to him to follow me, I started to descend cautiously. The depth to the bottom of the pit must be about 150 feet, and some time as well as considerably care was expended upon me reach the bottom in safety. Once down, Pepper and I started to explore along the banks of the river. It was very dark there due to the overhanging trees, and I moved warily, keeping my glance about me and my stick ready. Pepper was quiet now and kept close to me all the time. Thus we searched right up one side of the river without hearing or seeing anything. When we crossed over by the simple method of jumping and commenced to beat our way back through the underbush. We had accomplished perhaps half the distance when I heard again the sound of falling stones on the other side, the side from which we had just come. One large rock came thundering down through the tree tops, struck the opposite bank, and bounded into the river, driving a great jet of water right over us. At this, Pepper gave out a deep growl and then stopped, pricked up his ears. I listened also. A second later, a loud, half-human, half-pig-like squeal sounded from among the trees, apparently halfway up the south cliff. It was answered by a similar note from the bottom of the pit. At this, Pepper gave a short, sharp bark, and, springing across the little river, disappeared into the bushes. Immediately afterward, I heard his barks increase in depth and number, and in between there sounded a noise of confused jabbering. This ceased, and in suddening silence, there rose a semi-human yell of agony. Almost immediately, Pepper gave a long, drawn-out howl of pain, and then the shrubs were violently agitated, and he came running out with his tail down and glancing as he ran over his shoulder. As he reached me, I saw that he was bleeding from what appeared to be a great claw wound in the side that almost laid bare his ribs. Oh no. Seeing Pepper thus mutilated, a furious feeling of anger seized me, and whirling my staff, I sprang across into the bushes from which Pepper had emerged. As I forced my way through, I thought I heard the sound of breathing. Next instant, I had burst into a little clear space just in time to see something, livid white in color, disappear through the bushes on the opposite side. With a shout, I ran toward it. Though I struck and probed through the bushes with my stick, I neither saw nor heard anything further, and so returned to Pepper. There, after bathing his wound in the river, I bound my wetted handkerchief round his body, having done which, we retreated up the ravine and into the daylight again. On reaching the house, my sister inquired what had happened to Pepper, and I told her he had been fighting with a wildcat, of which I had heard there were several about. I felt it would be better not to tell her how it really happened, though, to be sure, I scarcely knew myself. But this I did know, that the thing I had seen run into the bushes was no wildcat. It was much too big, and had, so far as I observed, a skin like a hog's, only of a dead, unhealthy white color. And then it had run upright, and nearly so, upon its hind feet, with a motion somewhat resembling that of a human being. This much I had noticed in my brief glimpses, and truth to tell, I felt a good deal of uneasiness, besides curiosity, as I turned the matter over in my mind. It was the morning that the above incident had occurred. Then, it would be after dinner, as I sat reading, that, happening to look up suddenly, I saw something peering over in the window ledge, I saw something peering in over the window ledge, the eyes and ears alone showing. "A pig, by Jove!" I said, and rose to my feet. Thus I saw the thing more completely, but it was no pig. God alone knows what it was. It reminded me vaguely of the hideous thing that had haunted the great arena. It had a grotesquely human mouth and jaw, but with no chin of which to speak. The nose was prolonged into a snout. Thus it was, with little eyes and queer ears, gave it such an extraordinarily swine-like appearance. Of forehead there was little, and the whole face was of a unwholesome white color. For perhaps a minute I stood looking at the thing with an ever-growing feeling of disgust and some fear. The mouth kept jabbering inanely, and once emitted a half-swinish grunt. I think it was the eyes that attracted me the most. They seemed to glow at times with a horribly human intelligence, and kept flickering away from my face over the details of the room as though my stare disturbed it. It appeared to be supporting itself by two claw-like hands upon the windowsill. This claw, unlike the face, were a clayey brown hue, and bore an indistinct resemblance to human hands, in that they had 4 fingers and a thumb, though these were webbed up to the first joint, much as a duck's. Nails it had also, but so long and powerful that they were more like talons of an eagle than aught else. As I have said before, I felt some fear, though almost of an impersonal kind. I may explain my feeling better by saying that it was more of a sensation of abhorrence, such as one might expect to feel if brought in contact with something superhumanly foul, something unholy, belonging to some hitherto undreamt state of existence. Yeah, they're awful. I cannot say that I grasped these various details of the brute at the time. I think they seemed to come back to me afterward as though imprinted upon my brain. I imagined more than I saw as I looked at the thing, and the material details grew upon me later. For perhaps a minute I stared at the creature, then as my nerves steadied a little, I shook off the vague alarm that held me. Oh, excuse me. Nope, God damn it. For perhaps a minute I stared at the creature, then as my nerves steadied, I shook off the vague alarm that held me, and took a step toward the window. Even as I did so, the thing ducked and vanished. I rushed to the door and looked round hurriedly, but only the tangled bushes and shrubs met my gaze. I ran back to the house and, getting my gun, sallied out to search through the gardens. As I went, I asked myself whether the thing I had just seen was likely to be the same of which I had caught a glimpse of in the morning. I inclined to think it was. I would have taken Pepper with me, but judged it better to give his wound a chance to heal. Besides, if the creature I had just seen was, as I imagined, his antagonist in the morning, it was not likely that he would be of much use. I began my search systematically. I was determined, if it were possible, to find and put an end to that swine thing. This was, at least, a material horror. At first, I searched cautiously, with the thought of Pepper's wound in my mind, but as the hours passed and not a sign of anything living showed in the great lonely gardens, I became less apprehensive. I felt almost as though I would welcome the sight of it. Anything seemed better than this silence, with the ever-present feeling that the creature might be lurking in every bush as I passed. Later, I grew careless of my danger to the extent of plunging right through the bushes, probing with my gun barrel as I went. At times I shouted, but only the echoes answered back. I thought thus, perhaps, to frighten or stir the creature into showing itself, but only succeeded in bringing my sister Mary out to know what was the matter. I told her that I had seen the wildcat that had wounded Pepper, and that I was trying to hunt it out of the bushes. She seemed only half satisfied and went back into the house with an expression of doubt upon her face. I wondered whether she had seen or guessed anything. For the rest of the afternoon, I prosecuted the search anxiously. I felt that I should be unable to sleep with that bestial thing haunting the shrubberies, and yet, when evening fell, I had seen nothing. Then, as I turned homeward, I heard a stout, unintelligible noise among the bushes to my right. Instantly, I turned and, aiming very quickly, fired in the direction of the sound. Immediately afterward, I heard something scuttling away among the bushes. It moved rapidly, and in a minute had gone out of hearing. After a few steps, I ceased my pursuit, realizing how futile it must be in the fast-gathering gloom. And so, with a curious feeling of depression, I entered the house. That night, after my sister had gone to bed, I went round all the windows and the doors of the ground floor, and saw to it that they were securely fastened. This precaution was scarcely necessary as regards to the windows, as all of those in the lower story were strongly barred, but with the doors, of which there were 5, it was wisely thought, as not one was locked. Having secured these, I went to my study, yet somehow, for once, the place jarred upon me. It seemed so huge and echoey. For some time I tried to read, but at last finding it impossible, I carried my book down to the kitchen, where a large fire was burning, and sat there. I dare say I had read a couple of hours when suddenly I heard a sound that made my lower body book. Made me lower. Excuse me. I heard a sound that made me lower my book and listen intently. It was a noise of something rubbing and fumbling against the back door. Once the door creaked loudly, as though force was being applied to it. During those few short moments, I experienced an indescribable feeling of terror, such as I should have believed impossible. My hands shook, a cold sweat broke out on me, and I shivered violently. Gradually, I calmed. The stealthy movements outside had ceased. Then, for an hour, I sat silent and watchful. All at once, the feeling of fear took me again. I felt as I imagine an animal must under the eye of a snake. Yet now I could hear nothing. Still, there was no doubting that some unexplained influence was at work. Gradually, imperceptibly almost, something stole on my ear, a sound that resolved itself into a faint murmur. Quickly, it developed and grew into a muffled but hideous chorus of bestial shrieks. It appeared to rise from the bowels of the earth. I heard a thud and realized in a dull, half-comprehending way that I had dropped my book. After that, I just sat, and thus the daylight found me, when it crept wanly through the barred high windows of the great kitchen. With the dawning light, the feeling of stupor and fear left me, and I came more into possession of my own senses. Thereupon I picked up my book and crept out to the door to listen. Not a sound broke the chilly silence. For some minutes I stood there. Then, very gradually and cautiously, I drew back the bolt, and opening the door, peeped out. My caution was unneeded. Nothing was to be seen, save the gray vista of dreary, tangled bushes and trees extending to the distant plantation. With a shiver, I closed the door and made my way quietly up to bed. Oh boy, is this the Swine-Things? It is. Okay. Give me one moment and we will continue with the Swine-Things. Oh, baby, you ain't seen the last of them yet. I bet they're all up and down this book. Yes, I'm back. Yeah, this story just kind of hit the ground running and it ain't stopped yet. Let's see here. Well, I think we can definitely get through a couple more chapters. Honestly, I'd be tempted to like go on to like read maybe almost the rest of this book tonight if I wasn't starting to get kind of hungry. But we'll definitely get a couple of more chapters done tonight. Yeah, I'm really liking it. Now we're up to the chapter that I've kind of been waiting to get to since I first saw the chapter list, I'll be honest. Chapter 6, The Swine-Things. It was evening, a week later. My sister sat in the garden, knitting. I was walking up and down, reading. My gun leant up against the wall of the house, for, since the advent of that strange thing in the gardens, I had deemed it wise to take precautions. Yet, through the whole week, there had been nothing to alarm me, either by sight or sound, so that I was able to look back calmly to the incident, though still with a sense of unmitigated wonder and curiosity. I was, as I have just said, walking up and down and somewhat engrossed in my book. Suddenly, I heard a crash away in the direction of the pit. With a quick movement, I turned and saw a tremendous column of dust rising high into the evening air. My sister had risen to her feet with a sharp exclamation of surprise and fright. Telling her to stay where she was, I snatched up my gun and ran toward the pit. As I neared it, I heard a dull rumbling sound that quickly grew fresh into a roar, split with deeper crashes, and up from the pit drove a fresh volume of dust. The noise ceased, though the dust still rose tumultuously. I reached over the edge and looked down, but could see nothing save a boil of dust clouds swirling hither and thither. The air was so full of the small particles that they blinded and choked me, and finally I had to run out from the smother to breathe. Oh, whoops. Click on the correct page. Gradually, the suspended matter sank and hung in a panoply, hung in a panoply over the mouth of the pit. I could only guess as to what had happened. That there had been a landslip of some kind, I had little doubt, but the cause was beyond my knowledge. And yet, even then, I had half imaginings, for already the thought had come to me of those falling rocks and that thing at the bottom of the pit. But in the first minutes of confusion, I failed to reach the natural conclusion to which the catastrophe pointed. Slowly, the dust subsided until presently I was able to approach the edge and look about. Yeah, yeah, he really doesn't. For a while, I peered impotently, trying to get through the reek. At first, it was impossible to make out anything. Then, as I started, I saw something below to my left that moved. I looked intently toward it and presently made out another, and then another. 3 dim shapes that appeared to be climbing up the side of the pit. I could see them only indistinctly. Even as I started and wondered, I heard the rattle of stones somewhere to my right. I glanced across but could see nothing. I leant forward and peered I leant forward and peered over and down into the pit, but just beneath where I stood, and saw no further than a hideous white swine face that had risen to within a couple of yards of my feet. Below it I could make out several others. As the thing saw me, it gave a sudden, uncouth squeal which was answered from all parts of the pit. At that, a gust of horror and fear took me, and bending down, I discharged my gun right into its face. Straightway, the creature disappeared, and with a clatter of loose earth and stones. There was a momentary silence, to which probably I owe my life, for during it I heard a quick patter of many feet, and turning sharply, saw a troop of the creatures coming toward me at a run. Instantly, I raised my gun and fired at the foremost, who plunged headlong with a hideous howling. Then I turned to run. More than halfway from the house to the pit, I saw my sister. She was coming toward me. I could not see her face distinctly as the dust had fallen, but there was fear in her voice as she called to know why I was shooting. "Run!" I shouted. "Run for your life!" Without more ado, she turned and fled, picking up her skirts with both hands. As I followed, I gave a glance behind. The brutes were running on their hind legs, at times dropping on all fours. I think it must have been the terror in my voice that spurred Mary to run so, for I feel convinced she had not as yet seen those hell creatures that pursued. On we went, my sister leading. Each moment, the nearing sounds of the footsteps told me that the brutes were gaining on us rapidly. Fortunately, I am accustomed to live, in some ways, an active life. As it was, the strain of the race was beginning to tell severely upon me. Ahead, I could see the back door. Luckily, it was open. I was some half dozen yards behind Mary now, and my breath was sobbing in my throat. Then something touched my shoulder. I wrenched my head round quickly and saw one of those monstrous pallid faces close to mine. One of the creatures, having outrun its companions, had almost overtaken me. Even as I turned, it made a fresh grab. With a sudden effort, I sprang to one side and, swinging my gun by the barrel, brought it crashing down on the foul creature's head. The thing dropped with an almost human groan. Even this short delay had been nearly sufficient to bring the rest of the brutes down upon me, so that, without an instant's waste of time, I turned and ran for the door. Reaching it, I burst into the passage, then, turning quickly, slammed and bolted the door just as the first of the creatures rushed against it with a sudden shock. My sister sat, gasping, in a chair. She seemed in a fainting condition, but I had no time to spend on her. I had to make sure that all of the doors were fastened. Fortunately, they were. The one leading from my study into the gardens was the last to which I went. I had just time to note that it was secured when I thought I heard a noise outside. I stood perfectly silent and listened. Yes, now I could distinctly hear the sound of whispering. Something slithered over the panels with a rasping, scratching noise. Evidently, some of the brutes were feeling with their claw hands about the door to discover whether there were any means of ingress. That the creatures should so soon have found the door was, to me, a proof of their reasoning capabilities. It assured me that they must not be regarded by any means as mere animals. I had felt something of this before when that first thing peered through my window. Then I had applied that term superhuman to it, with an almost instinctive knowledge that the creature was something different from the brute beast. Something beyond human, yet in no good sense, but rather as something foul and hostile to the great and good in human. In a word, as something intelligent and yet inhuman. The very thought of the creatures filled me with revulsion. Now I bethought me of my sister, and, going to the cupboard, I got out a flask of brandy and a wine-glass. Taking these, I went down to the kitchen, carrying a lighted candle with me. She was not sitting in the chair, but had fallen out and was lying upon the floor, face downward. Oh, poor Mary. Very gently, I turned her over and raised her head somewhat. Then I poured a little of the brandy between her lips. After a while, she shivered slightly. A little later, she gave several gasps and opened her eyes. In a dreaming, unrealizing way, she looked at me. Then her eyes closed slowly, and I gave her a little more of the brandy. For perhaps a minute longer, she lay silent, breathing quickly. All at once, her eyes opened again, and it seemed to me as I looked that the pupils were dilated, as though fear had come with returning consciousness. Then, with a movement so unexpected that I started backward, she sat up. Noticing that she seemed giddy, I put out my hand to steady her. At that, she gave a loud scream and, scrambling to her feet, ran from the room. For a moment, I stayed there kneeling and holding up the brandy flask. I was utterly puzzled and astonished. Could she be afraid of me? But no, why would she? I could only conclude that her nerves were badly shaken and that she was temporarily unhinged. Upstairs, I heard a door bang loudly, and I knew that she had taken refuge in her room. I put the flask down on the table. My attention was distracted by a noise in the direction of the back door. I went toward it and listened. It appeared to be shaken, as though some of the creatures struggled with it, silently, but it was far too strongly constructed and hung to be easily moved. Out in the gardens rose a continuous sound. It might have been mistaken, by a casual listener, for the grunting and squealing of a herd of pigs. But as I stood there, it came to me that there was a sense and meaning to all of those swinish noises. Gradually, I seemed to trace a semblance in it to human speech. Gluttonous and sticky, as though each articulation was made with difficulty, yet, nevertheless, I was becoming convinced that it was no mere medley of sounds, but a rapid interchange of ideas. By this time, it had grown quite dark in the passages, and from these came all the very cries and groans of which an old house is so full after nightfall. It is, no doubt, because things are then quieter and one has more leisure to hear. Also, there may be something in the theory that the sudden change of temperature, at sundown, affects the structure of a house somewhat, causing it to contract and settle, as it were, for the night. However, this is as may be, but on that night in particular, I would gladly have been quit of so many eerie noises. It seemed to me that each crack and creak was the coming of one of those things along the dark corridors, though I knew in my heart that this could not be, for I had seen, myself, that all the doors were secure. Gradually, however, these sounds grew on my nerves to such an extent that, were it only to punish my cowardice, I felt I must make the round of the basement again, and, if anything were there, face it. And then I would go up to my study, for I knew sleep was out of the question, and the house surrounded by creatures, half beasts, half something else, and entirely unholy. Taking the kitchen lamp down from its hook, I made my way from cellar to cellar, and room to room, through pantry and coal hole, along passages, and into the 101 little blind alleys and hidden nooks that formed the basement of the old house. Then, when I knew I had been in every corner and cranny large enough to conceal aught of any size, I made my way up to the stairs. Yeah, not fucking tonight. With my foot on the first step, I paused. It seemed to me I heard a movement, apparently from the buttery. Is that a room in the house? Is that where you keep the butter? Which is to the left of the staircase. It had been one of the first places I searched, and yet I felt certain my ears had not deceived me. My nerves were strung now, and with hardly any hesitation I stepped up to the door, holding the lamp above my head. In a glance, I saw that the place was empty, save for the heavy stone slabs supported by brick pillars, and I was about to leave it, convinced that I had been mistaken, when, in turning, my light was flashed back from two bright spots outside the window, and high up. For a few moments I stood there staring, when they moved, revolving slowly and throwing out alternate scintillations of green and red, at least, so it appeared to me. I knew then that they were eyes. Okay, so not just for butter. That's good to know. Slowly, I traced the shadowy outline of one of the things. It appeared to be holding onto the bars of the window, and its attitude suggested climbing. I went nearer to the windows and held the light higher. There was no need to be afraid of the creature. The bars were strong, and there was little danger of it being able to move them. And then, suddenly, in spite of the knowledge that the brute could not reach or harm me, I had a return of the horrible sensation of fear that had assailed me on that night, a week previously. It was the same feeling of helplessness, shuddering fright. I realized dimly that the creature's eyes were looking into mine with a steady, compelling stare. I tried to turn away, but could not. I seemed now to see the window through a mist. Then I thought other eyes came and peered, and yet others, until a whole galaxy of malignant, staring orbs seemed to hold me in thrall. My head began to swim and throb violently. Then I was aware of a feeling of acute physical pain in my left hand. It grew more severe and literally forced my attention. With a tremendous effort, I glanced down, and with that, the spell that had held me was broken. I realized then that I had, in my agitation, unconsciously caught hold of the hot lamp glass and burnt my hand badly. I looked up to the window again. The misty appearance had gone, and now I saw that it was crowded with dozens of bestial faces. With a sudden access of rage, I raised the lamp and hurled it full at the window. It struck the glass, smashing a pane, and passed between the two of the bars out in the garden, scattering burning oil as it went. I heard several loud cries of pain, and as my sight became accustomed to the dark, I discovered that the creatures had left the window. Pulling myself together, I groped for the door, and having found it, made my way upstairs, stumbling at each step. I felt dazed, as though I had received a blow to the head. At the same time, my hands smarted badly, and I was full of a nervous, dull rage against those things. Reaching my study, I lit the candles. As they burnt up, their rays were reflected from the rack of firearms on the side wall. At the sight, I remembered that I had there a power which, as I had proved earlier, seemed as fatal to those monsters as to more ordinary animals, and I determined I would take the offensive. First of all, I bound up my hand, for the pain was fast becoming intolerable. After that, it seemed easier, and I crossed the room to the rifle stand. I selected a heavy rifle, an old and tried weapon, and having procured ammunition, I made my way up into one of the small towers with which the house is crowned. From there, I found that I could see nothing. The gardens presented a dim blur of shadows, a little blacker perhaps where the trees stood. That was all, and I knew that it was useless to shoot down into all of that darkness. The only thing to be done was to wait for the moon to rise. Then I might be able to do a little execution. In the meantime, I sat still and kept my ears open. The gardens were comparatively quiet now, and only an occasional grunt or squeal came up to me. I did not like this silence. It made me wonder on what devilry the creatures were bent. Twice I left the tower and took a walk through the house, but everything was silent. Once I heard a noise from the direction of the pit, as though more earth had fallen. Following this, and lasting for some 15 minutes, there was a commotion among the denizens of the gardens. This died away, and after that, all was again quiet. About an hour later, the moon's light shone above the distant horizon. From where I sat, I could see it over the trees, but it was not until it rose clear of them that I could make out any of the details in the gardens below. Even then, I could see none of the brutes, until, happening to crane forward, I saw several of them lying prone, up against the wall of the house. What they were doing I could not make out. It was, however, a chance too good to be ignored. And, taking aim, I fired at the one directly beneath. There was a shrill scream, and as the smoke cleared away, I saw that it had turned on its back and was writhing feebly. Then it was quiet. The others had disappeared. Immediately after this, I heard a loud squeal in the direction of the pit. It was answered 100 times from every part of the garden. This gave me some notion of the number of the creatures, and I began to feel that the whole affair was becoming even more serious than I had imagined. As I sat there, silent and watchful, the thought came to me. Why was all of this? What were these things? What did it mean? Then my thoughts flew back to that vision, though even now I doubt whether it was a vision, of the plane of silence. What did that mean? I wondered, and that thing in the arena. Ugh. Lastly, I thought of the house I had seen in that faraway place, that house so like this in every detail of external structure that it might have been modeled from it, or this from that. I had never thought of that. At that moment, there came another long squeal from the pit, followed a second later by a couple of shorter ones. At once the garden was filled with answering cries. I stood up quickly and looked over the parapet. In the moonlight, it seemed as though the shrubberies were alive. They tossed hither and thither as though shaken by a strong, irregular wind, while a continuous rustling and a noise of scampering feet rose up to me. Several times I saw the moonlight gleam on running white figures among the bushes, and twice I fired. The second time my shot was answered by a short squeal of pain. A minute later, the gardens lay silent. From the pit came a deep, hoarse babble of swine talk. At times, angry cries smote in the air, and they were answered by multitudinous gruntings. It occurred to me that they were holding some kind of council, perhaps to discuss the problem of entering the house. Also, I thought they seemed much enraged, probably by my successful shots. It occurred to me that now would be a good time to make a final survey of our defenses. This I proceeded to do at once, visiting the whole of the basement again and examining each of the doors. Luckily, they were all, like the back one, built of solid iron-studded oak. Then I went upstairs to the study. I was more anxious about this door. It is palpably of a more modern make than the others, and though a stout piece of work, it has little of their ponderous strength. I must explain here that there is a small raised lawn on this side of the house, upon which this door opens, the windows of the study being barred on this account. All of the other entrances, excepting the great gateway, which is never opened, are in the lower story. Ooh, that seems like a good cliffhanger to leave up on. We'll leave Chapter 7, The Attack, for next week, I think. Yeah, I'm really liking this story. Holy shit. Yeah, it got very intense. It sort of reminds me a little bit, if I could make the obvious comparison with the alien beings and the weird racial stuff. It does feel like Lovecraft, but like with actual things happening in it. That's sort of just the comparison that comes immediately to my mind. Also, Tony, I hope you're not right, because I thought about like strange inhuman creatures, and I was like, oh, that's going to be a weird racial metaphor, and they're pale, so like maybe they're Irish. There's some weird allegory, some weird gross allegory. I hope not. I hope that this book goes better places than that. I have some faith, some hope at least. Yeah, yep. I mean, that's very, very contemporary of like that sort of like racially inspired, like animalistic non-people. Like I mentioned Lovecraft is one, but like it's not uncommon for the era. It is an unfortunate sort of thing, and I just hope that it is not like a terribly big deal to the story. I mean, yeah, it's not like I just don't like it, that sort of thing. It sort of spoils a bit of the joy of a story. But yeah, it's also sort of quaint and very I don't have a word for it. Just it's very old. But thanks for hanging out, guys. I had a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to reading another mystery, and maybe... Well, how many chapters left is this? We are on chapter 7, and there are 27 chapters, so we're probably not going to finish that next week, but we're going to get into it. Oh, one of the chapters is called Pepper. We remarked on that, I think, at the time, but, I don't know why this keeps failing. I'm gonna have to just download some music for background. This little live station is failing me pretty consistently. Yeah, I'm glad you guys came, had fun. I feel like I need to say, just to top off the end, like, of course, still trying to get, oh, and thank you, Music Prob, for subbing, or not subbing. Excuse me, I ain't got subs yet, but for following, I really do appreciate it. I'm trying to hit 50 followers so that I can get affiliate status and do all that fancy sub business. So any amount of like sharing this around that y'all can do, just I appreciate y'all coming either way. I'm gonna have to get my own music. But as it stands, we'll pick up on Wednesday with more Journey to a Strange Planet. That game is obnoxious, but I'm having a lot of fun with it, so I don't really care. And then, Tony, I'll try to get the VOD up for the Rabbits if you want to like catch up on that. But we'll definitely finish that game up on Friday, along with some more of the bundle for racial justice and that good stuff. But I think that's gonna be it for me tonight. So thanks for coming, y'all.